we're looking to use this as a tool to resist state control, right?
And that's what a lot of people do right now.
Right.
It keeps keeping people alive around the world. And like, Myanmar, for example, like how they funding their revolution? It's their Bitcoin. How do Venezuelans get stuff? A lot of it's Bitcoin. So it works. In the West, it's largely a casino.
And we saw issues like in Canada with the trucker revolt, right? We saw like
exactly right. People got their banking shut down, and they saw, oh shit, we can see there's a reason for Bitcoin, but is it big enough yet?
No, but then the Bitcoin became an issue, right? With them blacklisting addresses and.
That's because they were taking it through a central website.
This week on Monero Talk is sponsored by Cake Wallet. Store, send, receive, and exchange your Monero and Bitcoin safely on iOS and Android too. Cake Wallet is open source, and you always control your own keys. And by StealthEX, an instant exchange where privacy is the top concern. Go to stealthex.io to instantly exchange between Monero and 450 plus assets without having to create an account or register, and with no limits. Making StealthEX a simple way to purchase Monero with crypto anonymously. Monero Talk is also made possible from contributions by viewers and listeners like you. And supporting us is easier than ever. By typing in monerotalk.crypto in your monero.com or Cake Wallet send address field to send us a tip. This week on Monero Talk.
Douglas Tuman interviews Eric Voskuil, a Bitcoin anarchist, author of Cryptoeconomics, a comprehensive book on the fundamental principles of Bitcoin, and lead developer of the free and open source Bitcoin developer toolkit, Libbitcoin. The two discuss Eric's journey to crypto and his contributions to Bitcoin, the different ideological factions within the Bitcoin community, whether or not non-KYC anonymous transactions are possible in the white market, fungibility through privacy, ASICS as a centralization problem, Monero solving significant issues in Bitcoin, the future of crypto, and much more.
Monero Talk starts now.
All right. Eric, what's going on, man?
Doug.
Thanks for coming on Monero Talk.
It's a new thing for me.
You're a brave man.
I don't know the first thing about Monero, so.
Oh no! All right. That's.
I mean, I know the first thing. I know what I read in the funny pages, but that's about it.
Well, I've been enjoying your book. Very good stuff. Good stuff.
Great to see.
I kind of, initially just breezed through. I was looking for mentions of privacy and fungibility. Me being a Monero guy, I'm instantly drawn towards those elements of crypto. Yeah.
Monero, I think, tends to have a place of high importance on those aspects, which are pretty important. And I maybe in some aspects of the Bitcoin community don't get as much emphasis, which they really should. But that's, those are areas of privacy and security are the most important to me in terms of, both my software and my writing.
Yeah. What would, so if you don't mind, can you give a quick background in terms of Bitcoin? Like, why are we having you on this show today? I mean,
I don't know.
It looks like you know what you're talking about. You've been involved since, I think, 2014. You were a dev. Give us your background.
Yeah. I've been I don't know, I guess early 2014 when I got started. I was a startup guy for a while, and I was doing my my third startup when Bitcoin was introduced, and I had some familiarity with the concepts going back to the 90s, and so I just kind of kept ignoring it because I was so busy with my startup, and because I had seen those things come and go, DigiCash, et cetera, and as soon as I wound down that third startup, I took a look at it because of article by Andy Greenberg in Forbes and Silk Road, and I've been working on it ever since. I mean, really since that day, because I got it right away because of that prior experience. Anyway, I have a computer science degree. I joined the Navy right out of college, and I did that for 10 years. Flew airplanes off of boats, and then I kept coding. I always liked doing it, and eventually I left the Navy at the end of '98. I had been doing a kind of a bedroom startup for about a year or two, and so I did that for a number of years. And in 2006, I sold that to Microsoft, and
Cool.
That's how I ended up out here in Seattle.
Awesome.
I stayed there till I got paid, and then we stayed in Seattle because of the kids, and they're gone. So I'm still here for who knows what reason. But then we split that company in two. Actually, at the time we sold it, so I joined that company, the spin out company, for a couple of years, and we sold that. And then I was doing a third, which I shut down. And then that's when I found Bitcoin. So I found I wanted to find code that I could work in, and I looked at the Satoshi code. I was gassed. So I kept looking, and I looked at. I had done actually my third startup, because I had come out of Microsoft with some Microsoft people. I'd spent a lot of time in C# for like 3 years, and before that I was mainly a C++ guy. And so I took a look at Bitcoin, which was new, a C# thing, and then I finally decided it had to be in C++ if I was going to do it. So I found Libbitcoin somehow, and started rooting around in the code. This was late 2013, early 2014, and I decided I wanted to meet Amir, watch some Amir videos, and
Amir Taki, your friend.
Yeah. Is there another Amir?
I'm sure there is.
Yeah.
Probably not.
And so I was very interested in his personality, his perspectives on Bitcoin and everything. So I wanted to meet him, but he wouldn't respond to my emails because I was nobody. And I don't know why, actually. He's like that sometimes. But I was trolling through the Libbitcoin mailing list, and I found one of my old fraternity brothers had some posts in there, and I was like, and he happened to live in Seattle, so I went and saw him. I was like, do you know Amir? And they actually knew each other, and so he gave me an intro. They knew each other before Bitcoin, actually, and so he gave me an intro, and I went out to Barcelona, and that's where we met. So we stayed in touch ever since. I started working on the project. I was actually working on a hardware wallet for the first year, and I had a friend who did like high-end, another fraternity brother actually in Seattle, who did high-end consumer electronics design work, and I went through the whole design process, and I finally decided that I didn't want to actually make it. So I've been using Libbitcoin as the software stack, and I decided I really just like doing that. So I kind of went into semi-retirement, and ever since then I've just been working on this open source project. And I took some time once I started speaking, and I had my own conference in Hanoi in 2020. The software kind of stalled for a couple of years, so I went back to that. About almost 2 years ago now. So let me see. Let me see. It was early 2021. So about 2 years ago, I started full on back on the software, and I kind of reset. I've been working on it ever since. I spent about a month or two to get the book out. And I've helped the French, Italian, and Spanish editions come out. Those are just volunteer translations, but I do all the publishing and
very cool.
So I did spend a little time on that, but mostly it's just been software. I've tried to travel less and code more, and that's what I do. I just I like the software. I like the theory, but I decided it was time to get Libbitcoin up to where it was capable of. So that's what I do now.
Sweet. And what is the task there when you say getting it up to what it's capable of? Like, what's the goal?
Well, it was never really done, and that's been. I mean, there's different pieces of it that have been high quality and complete enough for commercial use, but most of the stack has really never been completed. And
can you explain that a little bit more? Like, what value is that going to create for those of us that aren't super technical?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it'll just be fun for me.
I don't know. You fly jets too? Is it just for fun, right?
Right. I mean, the only reason I had a startup company when I left the Navy and that sold to Microsoft because I was writing some software that I liked writing, and now I'm retired on it. I was retired by the time I found Bitcoin, so I just work on it because I like doing it, and I've raised money for other people to work on Libbitcoin. We've got a guy 2 years worth of pay now. He's a computer science PhD type and he's worked with me for a long time, and I've raised money for other people to work on it. I've never taken any money to do anything in Bitcoin. Only travel reimbursement if I'm consulting for somebody, but I don't take money for consulting or for coding or anything. And I've actually paid for a couple of Libbitcoin developers for a few years to work on it.
Oh, wow.
And to me, it's just something I want to see happen. Amir had a vision for it, which I think is pretty reasonable. That so I don't know how far you go back, and I don't know anything about you. So, but if you were around at the time of the Bitcoin Foundation, when that came and then went, I mean, I guess it's still out there, but
yeah, I remember when it was around, and then it was like controversial, and then
and Amir was stirring up a lot of that controversy. Mm-hmm. He was he found Bitcoin because he was an online gambler. He ran a online gambling site, or he did something with it. I don't know the details, but he found Bitcoin as payment system, and then he started working on it. And then he's like, hey, there's no development tools, there's no libraries, nothing, right? There's just this monolith that Satoshi wrote, and it's awful. So he started writing his own stuff. He found Patrick Straitman, who laid down the first line of code for Libbitcoin. Actually, later became a large miner, and now I think he's at Blockstream or was. But so they got it started, and the objective was to produce a full node, and that wasn't, that was its independent code base. And part of it was to produce a developer library, a set of tools for building other things on Bitcoin. Because I think he kind of had the foresight to see that, what was going to happen is people were going to build web APIs and everybody's going to connect to those and re-centralize everything, mm-hmm. which is very problematic, right? So if you don't have tools you can build on, then that becomes the easy way for people to get things done. And if they don't really, understand or care about the security, privacy aspects of it, then that's what happens. And that is to a large extent what happened. The other thing, there was kind of an internal private security mailing list for the Bitcoin dev types. And, I was never a part of that. So I'm just relaying what I understand, but there was some conflict with Amir because he can be a little different, and he got booted off the security mailing list. It basically kind of booted off the team, and this was around the time that the money was coming in from Bitcoin Foundation. These guys were salaried employees of the Bitcoin Foundation for the most part. Gavin and Mike and were when I started, they were the ones that were doing most of the work. And so there was a lot of technical conflict over some things that turned out to be, probably shouldn't have been done, be recognized now or have been undone since that Amir was against. And so as a result, he created the BIP system. BIP1 is Amir's creation of the BIP system. And that was based on Python. It was the PIP, Python Improvement Proposals, I guess. And so he kind of cloned that and opened up the discussion, formalized it a little bit, which is a major contribution in itself. And then created Libbitcoin to not only provide a set of tools for developers, but to provide an alternative to the voice that people had, because they were producing the only software anybody used. I mean, imagine if you were Netscape back in the day and you were the only web browser in the world, and nobody else ever made one, you have pretty much final say on everything, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what was the way he saw it. And so from my perspective, over the years watching this happen, I can very much see that there's kind of a monoculture, even though it is open source, there's a lot of people come and do minor contributions. There's a handful of people that do major contributions to what's now called Bitcoin Core, but was always Bitcoin D. And people, it's a necessity to kind of go along, or you won't get your code into the code base. And as a result, it really stifles conversation, I think. And I don't care. I don't never put any code in the code base and don't intend to in Bitcoin D. And we have a full stack that implements this much or more, and it's also C++, but it's never been based. It's never been a fork or derivative of Satoshi's implementation. It's a complete re-architecture, redesign more than once. And so we look at things differently. We have a different perspective from a technical standpoint, and also from kind of a community standpoint. And he created that, and I look at it as my role to finish it, because he was never the kind of guy to put polish on things. And I made software that my main customers were Fortune 500 companies when they sold the company. So you kind of know what it has to be like to really put it out and support it on a large scale. And so a lot of time on API consistency, quality test, maintainability, those kind of things, performance. Did a lot of prototyping and tossed that out and took the lessons learned, and so that's where we are now. Bitcoin D has a very different approach, because there's so many people that want to have a say, and there's a lot of use, so there's a lot of risk, and so it's very incremental. It's very cautious, but it also doesn't like to see design change, right? There's only one true design. So we do things just very, very differently from the time Amir started to now. It's just very different than Bitcoin D.
Very cool, man. And so what is like the real technical difference then between the two at the end of the day?
Technical difference. Well, I mean, protocol's the same. The consensus is the same as Bitcoin. We also, with a configuration change, you run Litecoin, you run reg test, mainnet, testnet on Litecoin and Bitcoin. So you have like 6 coins for maintaining, but it's almost no code difference at all. And, but there, I mean, I could sit here and rattle off technical differences. But one difference is it's a developer library. There's 10 repositories in GitHub, including a build system repository. The base repository system is just a set of tools for hashing, limited amount of encryption that's in Bitcoin, type system, serialization, deserialization, stream classes, just all kinds of fundamental stuff that you need when you work in Bitcoin. And some odd things that, you might not expect. They're not even in Bitcoin, some crypto stuff that Amir and some other people had put in that's not really Bitcoin, but is relevant to, some experimental stuff, I guess. Like ring signatures, for example.
We like those.
Yeah. So, right. If somebody wants to do that and write the tests and put it into our quality, we'll take it. It makes sense. But most of it is actually used directly in Bitcoin. There's a small amount of those kind of additional crypto tools. And so there's, then there's a database repository which implements its a hand rolled database, which Amir created after. So he made the switch to Level DB, which he didn't like, I think, before Bitcoin D made that switch, and then dropped it, after they made that switch, and went to a memory map file based set of tables, hash tables and arrays. And that's what we use. And I spent a lot of time on that, resolving some of the issues that were left behind from that. Fault tolerance, hard shutdown, leading to store corruption, things like that. And paging delays, or what's the other kind of main issue? And the main issue was the hard shutdown issue. But we get an in-memory database that's constant time lookup, and if you've got enough RAM, it's entirely memory resident, so it's extremely fast. And with building towards the future, we can swap out one little underlying map file and run on top of a NVRAM implementation with no changes, which is awesome. All right. So anyway, I spent a lot of time reworking and redesigning the database, and it's just completely hand rolled and designed for Bitcoin.
Would you say there's a difference philosophically between those that are working on core and like you and Amir and that group?
Some people.
Or like how you guys philosophically view Bitcoin, or how you view the value proposition of Bitcoin. Is it the same, or do you guys kind of view?
I think most of the serious core developers pretty much the same. And it's not like when we have like disagreements about things, typically they're technical, but they're not philosophical. There's a lot of philosophical, techno-philosophical debate going on right now about as a consequence of this NFT nonsense, about preventing people from doing things that are possible, right? Which is what Bitcoin calls policy.
You're talking about ordinals right now?
Yeah. And so policy, there's always been what we call policy in Bitcoin. At a minimum, the minimum necessary policy in Bitcoin is if you're going to create if you're going to accept transactions, which somebody has to accept if they're going to mine them. If they're going to accept transactions from the wild, you have to have a minimum fee policy. Otherwise, you just get flooded with costless junk, right? And overflow your memory or your disk. And Bitcoin D people refer to that as the mempool. I never, if I'm doing that, it's by accident. It's a transaction pool, right? And the Bitcoin doesn't store it in RAM, so we don't call it a mempool. We call it a transaction pool. And anyway, so there's this one policy that's necessary. The other policies, some of which either intentionally or inadvertently made their way into, as consensus, don't really make a lot of sense to me. So there's consensus rules that are done that were done either intentionally or accidentally, and kind of serve the purpose of trying to protect Bitcoin from having too much junk in the chain, right? The exit data that's not necessary. And then there's non-consensus rules that try to do the same thing. And there's a discussion going on right now about, the legitimacy of these things. So there's some people that, put non-monetary transaction data onto the chain. And they kind of therefore defend the right of anybody else to do the same. And other people don't like that. But there's also things like dust transactions. There's standardist rules, this whole set of policy rules. Then there's consensus rules about just stupid things like, you have to have one Coinbase and it has to be the first transaction. It has to have a null input. And all these things are just designed to kind of constrain what people can do, so they don't put like, oh my God, what if you put two Coinbases in one transaction? What would happen? You'd be wasting space. I guess that's why it was restricted, or it was just maybe simple implementation. But why does the input of a Coinbase have a null point on it, it should just be not there. So some of these are just implementation artifacts of the early work that Satoshi did, and some of them are just like dust rules or just attempts to minimize what ends up on the chain. But the reality is consensus is the only thing that actually controls that. So people are going to do what they're going to do. And there's this philosophical debate about whether, some people should try to control what other people do, despite it not being consensus.
What is your take on that? So like something like with ordinals, that's
my take is people can try to stop it if they want, right? Fine, go ahead.
Let the free market do what the free market.
Well, the free market's going to do what it's going to do. I don't really have to have an opinion on it. It's going to do it, right? And
nature will find a way.
Well, people think that like the mempool that has some sort of control. It doesn't. It's just a way to, it takes a half a second, for a transaction to go from here to a miner. And really the only people should care about unconfirmed transactions are miners. You might want to know that your transaction is kind of making its way to the miners or something, but really, why else would you care? I mean, people like ZeroConf, but that's another case where, you really don't have consensus control over that. So, anyway, the idea of pooling transactions is just so that you can find a block and mine it. You can just set up a website and say, post me your crappy transactions and bypass the entire mempool and just mine them, right? Mempool is just a convenience for miners to be able to get transactions and to do it sort of anonymously, But yeah, people are gonna do what they're gonna do, and I don't, my approach has always been to not try to stop people from doing what they can do by consensus. There's no point in that. And what we've seen over time is that there continues to be these ways to evade those types of restrictions that end up being more costly than if you just didn't have the restrictions at all. Mm-hmm. I have never implemented policy in Libbitcoin, just the fee rate policy, which is necessary for DOS protection. And there's other things that never implemented. Amir wasn't a fan of BIP 37, and neither was I, and never implemented it. And now it's just going away. So it turned out to be the right call.
I would stick on ordinal. I was going to try to get to ordinals later, but since we brought it, I want to stick on it just a little bit. So like the permissionless of it. So you can, let whatever people are going to use the block space for, they're going to use it for, if they can use it, whatever way. But what do you think of the potential fungibility ramifications? I know we're going to touch upon this, I think, in a couple different ways, but
I don't know, how does it impact fungibility?
Okay, well, so you're saying you don't think it does in any way, ordinal?
I'm asking you, like, I haven't really thought about it, but I don't see how.
I guess this idea that the way the ordinal system works is it's kind of uniquely identifying each Satoshi, right?
I guess I haven't looked into how it works. I really don't care that much.
Okay.
I mean, any transaction that follows a pattern, right? Like pay to script hash, whatever. At least they follow patterns, so you can identify something about the patterns. You can identify something about how, say, UTXOs get selected by wallets. You can use that to identify aspects of the wallets, and if this process is creating patterns around outputs, then yeah, it can. But you don't have to use it, so who cares, right? And if you got your money from somebody else who was doing it, is it not fungible? Well, no, it's perfectly fungible. And money's money, right? The question is only it comes back to privacy and tainting. If you can taint anything, then you've got a fungibility problem. To the extent that somebody can enforce censorship over that taint, right? If it's not enforceable, then your money remains fungible. Or if nobody cares to enforce it, right? It doesn't have to be censorship by miners for confirmation. It could be a wallet, right? Somebody doesn't want to take your money because it's been tainted, and they can see that, right? That's not confirmation censorship. That's just people don't want to take the money. So Bitcoin doesn't, coin is easily tainted, and that's one of the problems. And that's not unique to these ordinals NFT stuff. Maybe.
No. It just seems like it's another layer of, making it more obvious to some that Bitcoin is taintable. I've certainly always thought it was, but I think the ordinals kind of makes it even more obvious.
I mean, I don't know. It sounds like people are putting pictures on the, into the data. I don't know how that makes anything more or less taintable, unless you put a picture of yourself up there or something. I don't know.
Well, no, yeah, they're putting pictures, but then they're also, my understanding is the way that the Satoshis now, they're being classified using the ordinal system, where each Satoshi is basically uniquely identified.
Well, how do you get the identity? Where does it come from?
There's some system that they're using to basically analyze a Satoshi, and then
So it goes back to the original problem, which is Bitcoin's taintable. Publishing the taint on the chain is really not making it less tainted or more tainted. Sorry.
Right.
If you do it in private, you don't tell anybody about it, and then you apply your censorship over that. It's the same problem.
Yeah.
So the issue goes back to, if you want to transact privately and you can't, then you've got an issue whether somebody publishes that data or not. Secondary issue.
So how do you think about Bitcoin's fungibility then overall? This, so this ability to taint coins, how do you see that playing out? Do you think that is an issue for Bitcoin if it's trying to be censorship resistant money, or you're saying it's something that gets overcome?
There's two issues. One is, can you identify what you want to censor, and two is, can you censor, right? Mm-hmm. You can, clearly Bitcoin, all coins have a censorship risk in that somebody can simply mine and demand identity. So as long as you have a 51% attacker, for example, in Bitcoin, or majority staker in some other shitcoin, you can extract identity in order as a condition of transacting, right? Just like the legacy financial system does. You can demand an ID if show me your driver's license, your passport, if you want to submit this transaction, just like you have to do with every other electronic transaction in the world outside of Bitcoin like stuff. So that the ability to censor at mining gives you the ability to expose every single output and every single output that's ever going to get spent. So that's really a primary consideration, right? If people don't consider how they avoid a censor, but think that they can be, private in the face of a censor, they're mistaken. Right? If you can't be private in the face of a censor with any of these coins, the censor is just going to say, "Tell me who you are," or you're not getting confirmed, and therefore your money is not only not fungible, it's not money. Mm-hmm. It's not money, white market or black market. Right? So that's the primary issue always, is that to be censorship resistant, you have to be able to counter a majority hash power. Then, if you can get yourself confirmed, if you can counter majority hash power, then what's your concern about fungibility / censorship? Well, your concern is that you're getting confirmed, but they know who you are and they know what you're doing. And so somehow there's going to be consequences for that, right? And people won't want to pay the consequences, so they won't accept the transactions, et cetera. So now you're talking about exchanges and other, what I call merchants. People accept the coin. People accept the coin are intimidated into not accepting it, despite the fact that it can be confirmed technically. Then they won't. And I always make the point that the other rule that's very hard and fast about this is the only thing you have to do to eliminate the use of some aspect of any of these coins that the state doesn't want you to use is to make it illegal. That's it. The white market the white market won't do it. Otherwise, there'll be black market, right? By definition. So if you want to eliminate certain type of transaction, you want you want to eliminate a transaction that doesn't have identity associated with it. In other words, you have to provide your identity in order to transact. Well, I can't enforce it through hash power, so I can't demand your identity, but I can enforce it in the white market. So in other words, you can't spend your coin. Nobody will take it anywhere at any major exchange, any business that has, that pays taxes is not going to take your money because it's simply not allowed unless you have identified yourself. So there goes your privacy. So what you're left with is the privacy and fungibility of these monies exists only in the black market, and it only exists if the black market can counter majority hash power. Those are the two hard and fast criteria, right? White market has no defense against censor or transparency, none whatsoever. I don't care, how fancy your Monero cryptography gets. You cannot in the white market be private. If the state wants the identity, it's going to get it. It's just gonna say you need to give it. So
right, but you're giving your identity, but you're not necessarily showing your trail of transactions.
Absolutely, you are. You're showing you're not going to put any transactions in. So two situations. One is white market transparency. The other one is majority hash power control. If you're the state and you have majority hash power control, you have total transparency over anything that happens in the future, which means you can demand a total history over everything that happened in the past. If you want to allow anything to happen in the future, you have total transparency or the chain stops, right? Nobody's transacting anymore. You have total transparency up to the extent that you want it for any transaction. You can demand that somebody tells you where they got the coin, and they don't prove it, if it's not proven to their satisfaction, no transacting. And then just keep working your way back. Contract trace that coin. So if you have majority hash power control, you can enforce it at the source. If you don't, you can enforce it in the white market. You can simply say, if you accept transactions at your business, you must get them cleared through this web service, right? Banking service. Or you can't take a coin unless it implements our, policy, right? And that just means that, you're not going to be able to use the coin anywhere in the white market unless you say, just take it to the minimum, provide identity, right? I'm not taking your money unless you prove to me who you are and maybe where this money came from, which is pretty much the bar that already exists throughout the entire white market in electronic money today. And I think it would be naive to assume it's just going to go away because we came up with this new thing. So
when I go spend my cash, I don't have to tell them where I got it.
That's one of the reasons cash is going away.
Well, I know they're trying, but we still, are right. You could go spend your cash right now, and it's not.
Yeah,
that.
And you could spend lumps of gold. You can do those things if you trust the people you're transacting with. But
yeah,
if the state says, I'm sure you're aware that this is the case, right? If I take $10,000 out of my bank's going to go and tell the state that I did it, and they're going to want my ID, et cetera, right? So, and those restrictions are getting tighter and tighter. We got now reporting restrictions, I think, down to $600 on 1099s in the US. So that happened last year. So there aren't many even cash transactions that legally you can do nowadays privately. I mean, you can buy your coffee, but cash is eventually going to go away. And the reason for Bitcoin is to provide an electronic cash that has that private capability, privacy associated with it that paper money or tangible money has, or gold money, silver money, right? So yeah, you can still transact with tangible money, but if the state says you can't, now you're black market. That's kind of my point from the start, right? And it's probably going to say you can't. The cash will go away. and you'll be left with everything is completely transparent in the white market. And Monero, Bitcoin, whatever, is not going to change that in the white market. I don't know how people can believe that the state just won't pass the law, right? I mean, it might not happen, but the coin has no ability to stop it.
Yeah, of course.
So if we wanted, it becomes this is the political argument. Well, it's, Bitcoin's too popular. They could never pass these laws. Like, well, gold's popular, money's popular, pretty much all the things that are banned are the most popular things. So that's not really true that they can't. But the point is that there's nothing in the implementation, in the security model, that stops it. Mm-hmm. Bitcoin's security model extends only to those who are willing to not obey the law. And then if you're willing to not obey, then you can use it. But if you obey it, all they have to do is say no, and you're done.
Right. But I guess where that leads me then too is that Bitcoin really isn't built well for that use case, as in terms of being black market money.
No, I don't think
it's lack of.
Well, not for most people. I mean, it is possible to transact privately in Bitcoin. It's just not easy. It's fully pseudonymous, so your taint has to come from somewhere. But yeah, I mean, that's my opinion. That's the reason for core development, is to continue to improve on privacy in Bitcoin. The censorship issue from a majority hash power standpoint is the other big issue. There's privacy in terms of transaction tainting and linking of transactions, but there's also, as I pointed out, a significant issue in terms of majority hash power control. I mean, some people seem to think it doesn't matter how centralized mining gets. It's not a problem because we can just have delinked transactions, and that's bullshit. Right? If you have perfect privacy in your transaction linkage, but you can't prevent majority hash power control, you have no privacy at all. So those two things have to get better. There's a premium to being a large miner. The bigger you are, the better your profit margin is going to be, and that's an aspect of the design of Bitcoin. So that's a problem, because the larger the miner you are, the more likely you are to be shut down, identified. Right? It's not easy to hide when you're big. It's easier to hide when you're small. So if everybody was mining on small amounts of power, it might not be noticeable and be very hard to shut down. But if you're constantly losing money doing that, it's not going to happen. So that's a problem. In terms of keeping the cost of mining unapproved transactions at least fair with the cost of mining approved transactions. In other words, you want the profit margin to be the same. It's not going to be less in the other direction. You want them to be the same, because that minimizes your cost of paying for the premium you're going to have to pay to get black market miners to mine those illegal transactions. There's going to be a premium for doing what's illegal. And the presumption is it's illegal because it's not allowed. It's permissionless, so we're doing what's not allowed. So keeping that premium, eliminating that premium is ideally what we want. We don't want there to be a premium for being large when it comes to mining. And the other thing we want is we want people to be able to transact privately, right? Taint is going to exist. We don't want the taint of one transaction to affect those it transacts with. So we've got mixers, I know Monero does a lot of things, and I'm just not familiar with the details, but those are the types of things that, we don't want we don't want obscurity, which is what we get with mixers, because it's not good enough, which I think has been shown many times. But it's not the area I work in, and I've never even, never done anything with a mixer. So, but I have pretty good confidence from a technology standpoint to have faith that we're going to get to the point where transaction coupling is going to be much, much weaker. I have some confidence that we may be able to tackle the mining premium problems.
It's interesting. The two main problems you're bringing up are the problems that Monero has claimed to solve or is focused on, right? So privacy, and then the mining. So I don't know if you're aware, Monero is ASIC resistant, and it's primarily it's mined by CPUs. So there's no advantage over centralization for Monero. It's as of now, it's maintained its ability to be CPU mined. So that's. Are you aware of that?
I don't know the details. I just tend to speak in generalities when it comes to this, and basically, anything can be more efficiently. Any algorithm can be more efficient with specialized hardware. So that's
I mean, the way it's RandomX is the proof of work that Howard Schuon invented, and it's basically the CPU is the ASIC of Monero, the general CPU.
Yeah, like I said, I don't know the specifics. I've seen a lot of different attempts to deal with this situation, and they usually fall apart when I look too closely. Give you one example. Chia was going to be green. They weren't going to be whatever. They're going to be green. They're going to use space as hard drive space as your mining criteria. And as soon as I read the paper, it was like right when it came out, it said, all you're going to do is create an explosion in hard drive manufacturing. It's not, with exactly the same amount of energy being consumed to produce and ship and destroy hard drives and install them. And it was a couple years later, I had a discussion with Chia guy online. What's that?
I don't know the Chia project too well.
Why am I blanking the name? BitTorrent. Who's the BitTorrent creator?
I don't know his name.
Oh my God. Well, he's in. So he raised like $20 million and wrote a paper. We're gonna basically have proof of space.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of proof of computation.
Yeah.
And the whole point of mining is that it's going to consume in cost, the total reward. That's just an economic reality. So using free space in your drive sounds great until you realize that, your profit margin is climbing, exponentially, right? You never buy any new space, but you're the only, you and all the people with the free space are mining, and there's never any, really materially any more free space. So you just keep reusing this over and over again. There's no cost to you whatsoever, and you just keep reaping greater and greater rewards. And you realize that somebody else is going to want to capture those rewards, and they're going to start buying new hard drives, and then they're going to start buying them to the, so if you take the entire Bitcoin reward for a year and divide that by, whatever, $50 a terabyte, right? You'll figure out how many hard drives you're going to consume to consume that reward, because it has to be a new cost, right? It's not just, I've got the hard drive, I'm good for like the next century. It's got to be a new drive. It's got to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So anyway, I pointed that out, and there was a lot of resistance. And then a couple years later, I got a private message from one of the PhDs that they had working on the team. There was a big falling out, and they realized, that I was right all along, and they reset, and it became proof of stake or something. And
can you please take a close look at Monero? I want to make sure I'm not wasting my time over here, man. Jesus.
Well, I mean,
I'm surprised with Amir, actually, because Amir is a big Monero advocate.
I mean, if I was, I don't know anything about Monero except
just to take the time to look at it. I'm surprised he wasn't like, here, read this, check this out. Let me know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I focus on Bitcoin because it's I want to get this project done, and it's important to me. But it's not like I don't reject everything else. That's certainly not true. I think anything that follows the principles that Satoshi laid out is consistent and fine. But there's certain principles. So I tend to look at things from a very high level abstract point of view. And to me, like, okay, if you can make something that can never be improved upon with an ASIC, it doesn't really change anything from my perspective. It just means that, okay, you don't buy ASICs, you buy chips. Okay. So, ASIC manufacture is not the centralization problem in Bitcoin mining, even though a lot of people like to think it is. So to me, like, and also Bram, is it Bram Cohen? Anyway, I keep trying to remember his name. I think it was Bram. I was like, look, there's nothing wrong with Chia. You just got to realize it's not solving the problem you think it's going to solve. It's still going to consume as much energy as Bitcoin, and if it has the same reward level, right, which means people are paying for fees, et cetera, and the prices, whatever it is, then it's going to have the same energy consumption, and that turned out to be true. Mm-hmm. Well, so there was in my mind, there's nothing wrong with using that energy to manufacture hard drives, right, versus just burn power. It's just a lot more complicated. And so it's kind of like the same thing, the distinction between, say, ASICs and CPUs. Well, yeah, if you got to go make ASICs to do the mining to be competitive, that's a cost, but CPU's a cost. Everything that's really not what creates. It's not what creates the advantage to large mining in Bitcoin. The two advantages to large mining. One is being all in one place geographically reduces the relay time when a block is discovered, and as a consequence, you mine more blocks you have less time wasted mining on old blocks, old block headers. Because you're closer to your own blocks, and because you're larger, in a fair system, right? If you had 90% of the hash power, you'd be producing 9 out of 10 blocks. Well, if you're producing 9 out of 10 blocks, you're seeing 9 out of 10 blocks faster than everybody else. And that doesn't mean one company. That means just geographically closer. And a lot of people would argue, oh, latency doesn't matter anymore because compact blocks, blah, 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 blah. And that's really the opposite of the case. What's happened is you don't see as many orphans because this is what you would expect. Is mining is heavily centralized. You would expect to see fewer orphans, right? So we have a very heavily centralized system, and you're seeing fewer and fewer orphans. As if the system was highly distributed, despite fast relay time, you would see more orphans. And so that advantage to being all in one place geographically is one of the things it's kind of built in. It's a light speed issue, right? Data can only move so fast. And it doesn't really matter whether you're mining on ASICs, GPUs, CPUs, or hamster wheels. Everybody's going to mine on what's most optimal to mine on that they know about and is available. But then the other aspect you have of it is what's the proper term? Your payments coming infrequently, right? So as a smaller miner, as I'm getting older, my memory is just getting worse and worse. The infrequency of your payments creates an increased capital cost for you as a smaller miner, right? If you get paid once every year, even if you're getting a fair proportional payment to the amount of hash power you put in, you get paid once a year, which means you have to borrow money to cover your costs, until that point where your investment is paid off and you're reaping some reward. So you're paying interest on that time, and
so you're saying pools give you an advantage, obviously.
Right. Well, I mean, these two reasons are the reasons people pool.
Right.
If you didn't have these problems, there would be no reason whatsoever to pool. You would just fire up your miner on your desktop, like in the old days, and you would get a proportional reward to the amount of energy you put in. Right. There would be no problem. So the reason people pool, they started pooling this because these forces became fairly obvious. There's a premium to proximity. The closer you are together, the faster you see new blocks that are coming out. If you never produce any blocks, you're never getting that advantage. And then if you're only solving a block once every 10,000 years, you don't even know if your system's working, right? And if it's coming once a month, maybe it's probably configured right and it's working, but your payments are spread out too far. You join together with a large bunch of miners, and now you smoothed out your payments, which is a cost reduction. That's a real business cost, capital cost, and you're actually disproportionately obtaining more blocks as a group because you're larger and see them faster. So variance is the term I was looking for. I don't know why I couldn't think of it. So you have a variance discounts your profits, right? I call it the variance discount, and proximity gives you a premium, right? So there's a premium for being closer together, and there's a discount in your profits for high variance. Those two things are basically built into the protocol. Nobody's that's why I'm not as confident that we're necessarily going to solve them. There are some attempts. There's some attempts from people I work with, and Bob McElrath has had a long-standing attempt to deal with these issues with this Braid's pool idea. And there's others. The PETA pool was the first, but it suffers from a number of drawbacks, which make it even worse. I actually mined on PETA pool for some time. I mined Litecoin on PETA pool. It worked fine. It's just, it's super simple, set it up, totally, decentralized, but I'm not making as much money as somebody who's in the central pool.
Yeah, Monero uses a P2 pool.
PETA pool, yeah, that's
for that purpose, and it's growing in usage, and the way more money is. My understanding is you get higher payout using that versus other pools. It's just we're not seeing everybody poured over yet, just because it requires a little bit more work essentially to get it up and running in terms of ease of use.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about PETA pool, the one that was created for Bitcoin, Litecoin, others years ago that I used, PETA pool has significant known deficiencies in terms of cost advantage.
This is different. This is a Monero, created by the Monero community.
Yeah. Again, I don't know, but the problem is always when you have a truly decentralized pool is you have to deal with payment aggregation, and if you have a real cost for putting data on the chain, that cost needs to rise as more people participate in the pool, and you also have significant latency issues that not my area of expertise, but you have payment cost and latency issues that are significant enough to make it not viable on Bitcoin. And I would be curious to see how that would be any different on any other coin, because a lot of smart people.
Yeah, I don't want to misspeak. Maybe those issues do exist, but my understanding to date is that hasn't been.
Well, if you have a basically a free cost of block space, one of those issues is mitigated, right? The payout cost is dramatically reduced if you're not paying to get that essentially that Coinbase transaction confirmed. But then you still have the latency issue. So I don't work in that area. And there's some people that have worked with us that do. I spend most of my time just in the mundane engineering of making a performant node and software stack that can deploy easily, be reliable, and can support at some point large mining operations by independent individuals. Efficiently.
If you don't mind, I just want to go back kind of to the beginning. So, I know you discovered Bitcoin. You were aware of other attempts earlier that weren't decentralized. But what originally got you interested in the concept of digital cash? What's the
Oh, okay. So early mid '90s, I was still. So I finished school in '89, and I was in the Navy, and then by the time I was, through flight school and everything, I was programming again, just part time, and somewhere in there, the internet. I mean, I had used the internet in college, and it'd been around for a long time, but it became this new thing, and along with it came Phil Zimmerman, PGP, David Chum, DigiCash, and those were both really interesting to me. So I remember I got my first BGP key pair and published it on the MIT key server. I think it was up there until a couple of years ago. It was ancient. I started using internet telephony apps and just goofing around, but I remember I read somewhere in there, I decided to read Applied Cryptography because I didn't really get much of a basis in cryptography from a university computer science degree. And that was kind of exciting to me. And so, messing around with PGP and reading that led me somehow to DigiCash and Chom. And I knew some of the people that were involved in the financing, just weird connections through the Navy. And I got some backstory on that, which I found interesting. And I was reading the DigiCash patents, and I found my name on one of them, and I was like, that's interesting. So I emailed the company, and this was like the beginning of email. It was still pretty, at least in terms of general use. So I emailed the company, and I didn't get a response back. But so this other guy named Eric Voskuil was working with the company, and his name was on the patents. Anyway, so years went by, and a few years ago, I was out in Berlin for some Web3 conference that they kept inviting Amir to, and he wouldn't go to, so they finally got me to go. So I was like the Amir substitute. And I was at so we're in downtown Berlin at, I think it was Gavin Wood's house, Ethereum guy, and Polkadot and all that. So he was kind of sponsoring the conference, and he has a flat in Berlin, first floor, and kind of a fenced yard out there. And so they had a barbecue, and I got invited over to it by the organizers, and I didn't realize it was just like, it was a big conference, but it was just a small group of people invited, and I didn't know who was invited. I didn't know what was going on, but anyway, I walk in there, and a little bit later, David Chum walks in, and he was speaking at the conference, and I was like, holy shit, this is a guy I'd like to talk to. I'm almost always the oldest guy in the room when I go to anything Bitcoin. And I'm like, oh shit, yeah, here's a guy that's, he's a previous generation. I know he's older than me. So I had a good talk with him, and I told him how I'd sent him that email back in the early 90s, early mid 90s about my name being on one of his patents. He's like, oh yeah, well, yeah. Wonder what happened to that guy. He was a college hire. We pulled right out of the university in Amsterdam. My name is Dutch, right? And they were based in Amsterdam. And so I said, well, I looked him up. He's making video game stuff out in San Francisco or something, right? So that was fun. And then Richard Stallman walks in, and so I had barbecue, with Richard Stallman and David Chum, which I thought was fascinating.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and then the next day, it was, I don't know if it was opening day, but the opening speaker was David Chum. And then somebody else, and then Stallman had like the lunch slot on the, it's all one stage, I guess, or main stage. And then Snowden was on video after that. And then I closed the day on that stage. I'm like, this really isn't fair, right?
I had Stallman on this show. It was an interesting conversation. He's a little difficult to talk to. He's an interesting guy. He's not a true believer in, he has concerns with the digital cash for if it's completely untraceable. He doesn't necessarily think that might be the most
it's interesting.
which I was surprised to learn from him, you know. And we also had Phil Zimmerman. I had him at the last Monero conference. I had him.
That would be cool. Yeah.
Yeah, we had him at the conference. Well, he phoned it in, and I actually formed a relationship with him because building up to the conference, we spoke on the phone quite a bit. But he also, I was surprised by his, inventor PGP, all these philosophical reasons, wanting to preserve liberty in the digital age through encryption. But seems like he had some concerns with true, private, untraceable digital cash. The ramifications for that.
Not everybody comes to this from the same perspective. I mean, I don't know. I don't think you could classify Stallman as a cypherpunk, right? And I don't know about Phil Zimmerman. I really don't know much about him. But it'd be fascinating to meet him. Anyway, it was interesting watching these two giants of the world we're in, Stallman and Chom, sitting directly across each other on somebody's picnic table out in the front lawn, basically on the street in Berlin, having some barbecue and having a conversation. I don't know if they had met each other. If they had, it had been a long time, maybe not. Anyway, so we're a few of us are just sitting around the table, kind of listening to this, and some of the people there were much younger, and I don't know if they quite got the gravity of the situation, but just being able to watch them have this conversation, it was very polite. It was all very cordial and kind of professional, but you could see there was definitely some differences between them. Chom, I would say, is much more of your kind of libertarianish cypherpunk, kind of in it for the privacy and the freedom, and Stallman is, from what I gather, much more of socialist, communist type mindset than so they didn't, they're not the same, and it just kind of felt like it was kind of everybody arguing with Stallman at some point, right? Because it was all Web3 was all about privacy. This was a room full of Bitcoin-y, Ethereum-y type, kind of private money people, I guess. But yeah, it's interesting. Just because you're into open source doesn't mean you're into human liberty, I guess.
Right.
Do you love coffee and Monero as much as we do? Consider making gratuitous.org your daily cup. Pay with Monero for premium fresh beans, and if you like what you taste, send a digital cash tip directly to the Guatemalan farmers that made it possible. Proceeds help us grow this channel, Gratuitous, and Monero.
So what is your argument that you make when people bring up these concerns with true digital cash? It could be used to fund terrorism. It's gonna allow for black markets to flourish on the internet. How do you?
I think the whole point is to allow black markets to flourish. So
I agree, but I'm just curious. I'm curious, how you.
I came at this stuff. So I was a card carrying U.S. Libertarian Party member for like over 20 years. That started, I think, in 91, 92, somewhere. It was when I was in the Navy. Certain events that got me there, and then I just kept studying, reading like everybody else, and so eventionally I read Rothbard and decided really I couldn't hold with the libertarian minarchism, and I just became what Rothbard would call an anarcho-capitalist. There's a lot of anarcho-communists around, so anarchism is kind of a weird word, but that's how I got, and it was from my libertarian mindedness, kind of still very fresh at that time period, and seeing the what do we call them, the crypto wars, happening in the 90s, and then after 9/11, it all just, the floodgates coming, opening. So, to me, I like the technology, and it's an opportunity to work in something that I can appreciate, philosophically and politically as well. I also find, economic theory interesting, fascinating, a long-term kind of study for myself. And I've done lots of different businessy things and made products. So I've raised money, I've invested, I've done all these things, and so this is the world of Bitcoin kind of gives me an opportunity to do all the things I enjoy for all the right reasons. And I really don't have to care too much about whether anybody approves or not. And it's one of the reasons I like working on a small project that I can be a major contributor to. I don't, as far as, how do I respond to people who, want, panopticon money? I just kind of, what do I say? I like, you people are always going to be out there. It's, there's always going to be people that want to do that stuff. That's fine. This is, I don't look at like Bitcoin or anarchism as a way to take over. It's a way to opt out.
To exist.
And that takes it takes a while to come to that conclusion, I think. And that you're not necessarily you're not going to eliminate all the things that people do, but you don't have to contribute or participate so much. And in many parts of the world, the black market is the only market. I mean, what functioning market is there in North Korea? There just really isn't one. Anything you want, you're going to get, from the black market, even state officials. I also think people tend to look at these questions from the perspective of the U.S. or the West in general. Reality is it's a big world, and a lot of people benefit greatly from being able to operate in the black market as they should. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Ukraine, Russia. We have all these different. Take North Korea, right? Just all these different issues all around the world. China, parts of Africa. People need to be able to, keep their money, move it around without approval, and I think that's a good thing.
So what do you see how do you see it working out 10, 20, 50 years from now? Is it going, do you see it like there'll be a niche black market money, whether it's black market version of Bitcoin or it's Monero that something like Monero that runs that space, and you ultimately then just see it being niche and not getting too large, so it's those that want to opt out do? And how do you see the dynamic playing out, the powers playing out? Like, what is
I think
the end game?
I think private money is always going to be under attack. I think privacy is always going to be under attack. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'd call it niche. The black market's about 25% of the world's economy, so that's pretty significant. That's bigger than any one state money. So I don't think that, if you look at the world in terms of, all these different aspects of black market versus white market, black market has to use white market money, right? There's an interaction between the two that's necessary. So the black market is not going to ever be entirely black market money. And the white market, kind of by definition, is entirely white market money. But you look at the large banks that are always getting fined for money laundering. Are they black market? Because they're always breaking the law, right? So technically they are when they're doing that. Or the law is just so unclear that they have no way to know. That's also the case in a lot of scenarios. But so there's this grayer reality, but from a conceptual standpoint, it's easy. It's better to make these things clear when you're trying to explain how they work, right? Like, I'm very clear that in the white market, there will be none of this if the law doesn't want to allow it, right? By definition, it's just a definitional thing. The reality is people play both sides of that fence like banks do now. And that will always be the case, but it won't be just out in the open. That's what I mean, right? And so what do I foresee? I mean, I don't like to make predictions, but what I think that the best you can't assume that the benefit of a permissionless money is that you will get permission, right? So we have to start with the assumption that the security model matters. It's not just about voting, because voting is the status quo and we haven't gotten there. Right? It hasn't given us this. If voting worked, we wouldn't need any of these monies. If we could achieve our privacy, et cetera, through voting. So we have to start with the assumption that's not going to do it. And you have to start with the assumption that you won't get approval. And that leaves you with, okay, well, this is useful in this black gray market area. And that will always have to be the assumption. Otherwise, it's just not necessary. We don't have to do any of this stuff. So, so what does the world look like, centuries down the road? I don't know. Probably this bifurcation between ways people do things privately and the ways people do things publicly, which is largely, it's been the case for a long time. In paper state money and currency controls have been around forever. And when things got bad with that, people would just go to gold, silver, some kind of metal as a safe haven. And that's still possible, but it's just not very feasible in our electronic world. And that's really, Satoshi nailed the subtitle because really what you need is a digital version of that. You need cash because cash is private. And if you want to operate in an electronic economy private, with cash, then you need something other than credit systems. So I think that, there seems likely there's going to continue to be a distinction between white market, surveilled money and black market private money. And implementation wise, I'm sure there'll be changes in evolution, but I tend to think we're looking at a long-term evolution from where we are today. I mean, it's just the very beginning, right? Time goes on forever. When is this going to end? When does this need for privacy end? So I think some people tend to look at it like, oh, Bitcoin's been around for like a decade and it's old news, right? But I look at it like, maybe it's just because I'm older, but I look at it like, geez, this is fucking just getting started. It's like the internet, in the early days, nerds sharing files between colleges. Okay, yeah, it works. We can do it. And the security doesn't even exist, right? It's because it isn't necessary. But it evolved, and it's going to continue to evolve. Now, at what point is the internet just going to end? Like, we don't need that anymore, right? That seems unlikely. It seems like it's just going to continue to evolve and be something that, and I think the same thing's kind of true of Bitcoin, where it's very early, extremely early. And I think it's going to continue to evolve. And unless, the internet is communication, publication, these things, the need for those things don't go away. And Bitcoin is money, and the need for money doesn't go away. I guess if you're a Star Trek person, money goes away. If you're a Star Wars person, it's all credits. but there are some people in Star Wars who demand real money, and they say, no, I don't want your credits. Why is that? Right. So even though Star Wars was a long, long time ago, imagine it's some distant future where money doesn't probably go away, except in the kind of socialist Star Trek fantasy world where, the economics of the future are different, as they said. But so why would it go away? So what I look at is from my perspective, a much longer term view on development than something like, Satoshi's application. To me, it's like, I look at that, it's like Mosaic, right? It's like the first graphical browser, and it evolved to Netscape, which was the same thing, and eventually, it became something very different. And that's kind of the way I look at it. It's like, we've got to get beyond this application monoliths to be able to build things that are truly decentralized and not fragile, not impossible, not poorly performing, not uncompetitive. So that's, I think that evolution is going to require that, and that's why I work on it. I mentioned like NVRAM implementation before. I'm like, okay, people are all freaked out about like how much storage space Bitcoin takes up. This goes back like the NFT thing, right? Like Satoshi looked at this. I looked at this from the very beginning. I'm like, okay, we have linear growth of the chain. Okay, we bumped it up 4x. Okay, so we've got linear growth times 4 now. Still linear growth, right? So we got linear growth forever, unless we do something else, make it even bigger. But we've got linear growth of the chain, and we've got Moore's law. Moore's law is not ending anytime soon, as far as I know. We have not reached the thermodynamic limit of computational power. And so the amount of storage space, I mean, we're still under a terabyte, right? A terabyte now is $50 off the shelf. We're talking about SSD storage, not even like a disk drive, which would be even cheaper than that. And you can get it on a little SIM card, right? So you can put the entire chain on a little SIM card that costs like $50 or maybe $100 for one of those. And that's going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And you have an exponential curve laying on top of a linear growth curve. I looked at that from the beginning. I'm like, okay, I'm building for that. I'm building for the case where it costs nothing to store this chain and it's immediately retrievable in RAM. And I've been, okay. Fine.
Yeah.
Why do I have a mempool then? Right? Everything's so that's the way I look at these things. It's very different. I want to have this tiny little, processor that you can put in anything and it'll tell you whether something's money or not. Is that money? I don't want to have to lug my desktop around to figure it out. I don't want to have to, install Bitcoin Core to figure it out. Right? I just want this little embedded system that says, okay, that's money. Just like as easily as you can look at a, $10 note and go, okay, that's probably money. Because that's kind of an essential thing, right? If we're trading with money, then it's an essential thing. And that's what Bitcoin does. And you can't outsource it to somebody else, no more than you can outsource your router to somebody else. Right? Your router has to be where you are. And so Bitcoin is like a money router, and the blockchain is like the routing tables. It's the history. It's what tells you what's legit, right? And so we have a very similar analogy. You need hardware to run it on. Run on general purpose hardware. You need to run it yourself, and it's really just a cache of public data. Right? The blockchain is just public data. Even transactions are public. There's nothing private about it. There's no reason to encrypt it, hide it, tunnel it, or anything like that, except for maybe you don't want anybody to know that you have money. So from a black market money perspective, there is a reason to maybe hide you're using it, but all of the data is just a cache. Everybody's got it. There's no secrets, except for your keys. So,
but you're saying, but you theoretically would want to hide it, right? If you can obfuscate the
data itself is public. Anybody can get it, right? There's nothing about what's in the blockchain that's private data. So it was a distinction I was kind of making, and it gets lost without some more background. But, when you build a system like a banking system, the data is private. You're moving this data around through secret networks. You can't let the data be seen. In Bitcoin, the data is public. Okay, so if you have a system that moves public data around, and the only thing it's doing is giving everybody a copy of the cache, like the routing tables, right? You don't secure it. You don't secure the communications. You verify the data, right? Now, I don't really know how you verify routing tables, right? Like the data, how is it verified? I think you just trust the issuer. It's signed or something, but I don't know. I don't work in it. But with Bitcoin, if I have my software, I can verify the data. I can throw out whatever's garbage. And there's plenty of garbage. So I throw out the garbage and I keep the good stuff. But the data itself doesn't need to be encrypted. The network doesn't need to be private, right? not to verify the integrity of the data. The only reason you want that, you would need that privacy, is to not let somebody know that you care about the data. But if everybody cares about the data to some extent, then you don't really even need to hide that. And that's kind of the way it is today, right? Like, it's having the data is perfectly okay. It may not always be, and you may need to resort to something like Tor, or hopefully something better that allows you to communicate the fact that you're using it privately, but not the contents of the data doesn't need to be secured in any other way except for verification, which is an integral to the data. And this kind of gets down to design philosophy in P2P network and stuff like that. Like the data itself is what provides your denial of service protection, right? The price associated with the transaction, the fee associated with the transaction, et cetera. Beyond that, you just limit peers to how much query service time you're going to give them. But otherwise, you don't need any other denial of service protection. It's all based on price and validity, which is really an interesting aspect of the whole system. There aren't other systems like that I know of. I'm sure there's got to be some, but
what do you think of the fact that Bitcoin isn't being used as much as it was as black market money? So like actually on dark markets, vendors are moving away from Bitcoin. They're moving towards Monero. Do you think that's indicative of it not working as digital cash?
The weaknesses are well known. I really don't keep track of or even know what the you say people are moving. I don't know. I mean, to me, again, might take a very long-term view of these things, and if there's technology improvements that we can use to make things more private, maybe things that Monero's done. Maybe that means using Monero or moving those things into BTC. I'm not proprietary about these things. I look at it all as Bitcoin, right? When I say Bitcoin, capital B, I actually have a topic in my book that lays this out very clearly. Satoshi wrote a paper where the first use of the word Bitcoin exists, and he does not refer to the vast majority of things that make BTC a coin, right? Like very, very little of the consensus rules are actually described in there. So the concept of Bitcoin is just a concept, right? And the concepts, the things that make it what I call crypto dynamically secure, that give it its censorship resistance, are laid out in the paper. And so something that conforms to those principles is a form of Bitcoin. And there are many different ways you could form the consensus rules. The fact that they're changing, and they've been changing within BTC, which basically means there's been a series of new coins that everybody's kind of moved over to, or in some cases split into. We just keep the same stocks, ticker on the one that's called BTC. But there's, this is constantly evolving, and we still conform to those principles that Satoshi laid out. So one of the things that I anticipate is that over time, first of all, the market evolved a very kind of robust marketplace of different coins. Some of them are not what I would consider coins at all. Like, they don't conform to those principles. They're just not. There's some kind of scam or naivete or something. But proof of stake, for example, it's not. It doesn't have that security model. So, but you have got, take Litecoin, for example. You get a set of these coins that follow the same basic principles and have different trade-offs, with the potential for atomic swaps between those coins and different level of security of those coins, right? So those are engineering distinctions that people don't really care about. If you want to use your private money to do different things, I anticipate that eventually wallet software will just paper this over and you won't even notice the difference. You might want to put some money into long-term storage, but it's a very high fee for the high security. So you say, yeah, do that. Tell my wallet to do that. It does that, right? And you get it back, and you don't know how it does it. How the hell? Why the hell would anybody care? Those people wouldn't care. They just want to know that it's it's private, secure, et cetera. And that is one of the obvious solutions to scaling and security issues and trade-offs and sharding, et cetera, that people who want to see their coin go up in price don't want to consider. But I don't give a shit about price. So, I like the fact that people want to use it, and that's reflected in the price. That's great. And then it motivates people. But, if you're in it as a casino, then you're in it, you're not in it for the same reasons that I'm in it for. I want to see a viable money. And that doesn't mean one, to me, it doesn't make sense that it means one chain. I think the existence of different chains gives us the opportunity to make different trade-offs for different reasons. Litecoin, faster confirmation, lower level of security per confirmation, but you can wait much less time on average to get a confirmation. Okay, well then maybe it's better for buying your coffee, right? Maybe you take some money out of your long-term storage and move it into that, and then move some back. To me, that makes sense. And I could imagine you could form, 10 different chains of BTC, of what is the same rule set as BTC, put a different Genesis block down and make a minor change to the mining algorithm. And you've got, okay, by any reasonable argument, you've got 10 of the same coin. It's just different usage, right? So low usage ones, lower security, higher usage ones, higher security. Atomic swaps between them. Okay, what have you done? I don't have to use the high security chains if I don't care about that low security. So now I've sharded my database, right? I've reduced my fees for low security transactions. I've reduced my confirmation time if I want to. I have greater transaction throughput, right? I can solve all those problems with that model. And I think that's basically what the market's been doing. And I think probably your interest, bringing in different sets of rules, that's the thought experiment, right? I have the same exact rules, just a difference in the mining algorithm to make them independent. But then, if you've got some different rules that make things more private, for example, for some trade-off, then presumably you can move in and out of that for a reason, for a cost. And I think that ultimately, we are likely to see systems standardize on a set of chains that make up what people call money. Similar, analogy to, different denominations.
So you don't think that the network effect essentially then will just be around one chain, but it will be around a group of chains that fulfills the end goal of digital cash?
Is the network effect around the dollar or the $10 bill? Why would anybody care? The reason, so I mean, it's being a little bit facetious, but the reason so people have argued that, well, if you can have any number of chains, so I use the term chain to refer to the history, whereas coin refers to the rules. So you get the same set of rules in two different histories, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a question of what somebody happened to mine that day. So anyway, you could have, if you had any number of coins, then they'd all be worthless because there's unlimited supply. And this is just constant inability of people to understand what is meant by the term supply and the supply-demand relation that formulates price. Supply is not a quantity. Supply is a demand. It's just the demand of the other party. So the willingness of somebody to trade it for something else, a preference of it for something else. So as we see, so in Bitcoin, it's demand and demand determines price, right? It's the demand of the people giving it up and the demand of people wanting it in exchange for something else because it's money. In other words, money being completely fungible, both sides of the demand are the demand for the money, the supplying of it and the demanding of it. So you have demand for this money, and the demand as unique. Bitcoin is unique in like two major ways. One is, in a single history, it has a fixed supply, but it also has a fixed transaction rate. And that's not true of anything that exists in the universe, right? Nothing else has a fixed, has a competitive cost to hand it to somebody else that rises the more people are doing it around the world. And so what that implies is that the more demand there is to use it, the more it costs to use it. So in other words, increasing demand decreases demand. Whereas in everything else that exists in the world, what people are familiar with, increasing demand increases supply. Okay, but in other words, if you think about the supply-demand relation, you know, increasing demand increases supply and keeps price stable, but increasing demand can also decrease demand to keep price stable. They have the same effect, and so that's what you have with Bitcoin, its relation to fees, and it doesn't matter. I know I think Monero is, you know, what it's not what we call fixed supply, but it doesn't matter because as long as it's a market money, the production of new coin doesn't change price either. It's not price inflationary. It's another thing people have a really hard time understanding. But the point is that as increasing demand decreases demand, you hit a limit, right? This money, for example, Bitcoin not being usable for a penny transaction, if the fees, you know, are a penny per transaction, right? It costs more. You know, it has, if the fees are even 10% of what a transaction is, that's you know, if you're gonna borrow some Bitcoin, run a business, and then pay it back, those two transactions would be 20% of your of what you borrowed, which means that's 2 years worth of profit for a typical business. You know, 10% profit margin. So you've wiped out 2 years worth of profit just to make the transactions, right? So if you're approaching that level, you're probably not viable as a money. And so what happens? Well, people still need money. Okay, so that demand spills over into another place. That's a substitute. And I wrote this up in, you know, substitution principle. We've already got substitutes for Bitcoin, or, you know, Bitcoin is a substitute for other monies. But presently, fee levels aren't maybe high enough to make that happen. When they are, then the demand will exist, and presumably that will cause the formation of a second nearly identical chain, and security will build up in that chain. Fees will rise, security will rise along with it, and there'll be a reason to do a third. And if it drops, maybe the reason to do a third will disappear, and people will atomic swap away from that back into their other ones. So there is really no limit to the extent at which that can happen, and I find that interesting. I don't know. It's, you know, why it's already happening. It's not like, why wouldn't that happen? It already happens.
What do you think of Monero's? I know you haven't taken a close look at Monero, but Monero's dynamic block size. So Monero has dynamic blocks that, you know, scale with more usage, so fees actually essentially stabilize or go down even when there's more demand.
I don't really like it because, you know, I think it's been pretty well shown that blockchains really aren't shardable. I think Peter Todd did a lot of work on this. I think he actually determined that he had proven that it wasn't possible, right? So if you're in a situation where in order to validate any money, you have to accept an arbitrarily large amount of data, you're no longer in that Moore's law overcomes the linear growth of the chain scenario, right? And what I was describing with, you know, variable number of chains supporting the entire economy is that each one of them is independent, right? Which means you don't have to have them all. You only have to have the ones you care about if you want to validate your money. So ultimately, it presents a scalability problem, which we've seen in monies that don't limit that size. Block size being arbitrary annoys people. You know, annoys me as, you know, as a programmer who likes to think of things being elegant, you know, and existing for certain reasons. But there's a good significant number of magic numbers in Bitcoin. You know, 10 minutes.
So you don't think Moore's law could take? I mean,
Moore's law can't solve arbitrary growth, I mean, you can't predict how much growth there will be once you don't have a limit, right? I don't know. I haven't looked at specifics, but it's if there is no bound.
Well, no, there's penalties if you try to, there's incentives there to not want to just put spam in the chain, if that's what you're referring to.
No, that's not what I'm talking about at all. I mean,
Okay.
I don't think that the term spam to me is meaningless. That's just a low fee transaction, lower than other transactions. And if people are accepting low fee transactions, then, it just means there's not much demand. And so,
well, I guess what I'm saying, there's penalties there where it doesn't economically make sense for you to try to just, as a miner, stuff in more and more and more and more transactions, make the blocks larger and larger. You get penalized initially if you just try to make excessively large blocks.
I mean, it's one of two things. Either it's effectively a limit that creates linear growth, or it's not, right?
Yeah.
If it is, then I don't know, a constant number seems fine to me. Right? I don't know why varying it would be helpful. Price varies, and price determines who gets hurt.
Wouldn't it be helpful for just lowering the fees so you could do more transactions on chain?
Well, yeah, you can make. You could lower. You could eliminate the block limit altogether and have lowest possible fees in exchange for, the miner making the decision on when it's time to stop accepting transactions into a candidate block and actually mine on the block. Right? They have to make that decision at some point. But presumably, they're going to grab as many possible fees as they can, which means they're going to make the blocks as big as they possibly can. Right? That is technically fine except when you consider the fact that you want this to be able to be done in private, secretly, because it's not allowed. And making it, I think this has already been shown, right? Some coins have removed such limits and exceeded the ability of anybody to actually run them. Or pretty much anybody to run them as predicted. So, you can create some incentive model to keep that value small, or you can just cap the value and there's your incentive model, right? Take the highest value transactions. That's your incentive, is to get the ones you can that fit into the time, and then move to the next one. And if by the way, if that is becoming too expensive, what I suggested is any number of additional chains can fill that void, right? Can accept lower fee transactions, and there is no limit to that. But those are effectively sharded between each other, right? There's no connection between these, say, 10 chains where Bitcoin 0 is spilling over into Bitcoin 1 is spilling over into Bitcoin 2. Well, if I only care about Bitcoin 2 because I do, coffee transactions and that's it, I don't need to secure millions of dollars. I only have that one and I can run it. If I'm only securing high value transactions, I also only need that one and I can run that. If I can mine that, I can decide I only want to mine that one. I mine the other one somewhere else. So the ability to keep these arbitrary amounts of data. I'm not suggesting there's any limit on the amount of data that can be put into blockchains. There isn't. I'm suggesting that the data, the way the design exists today, is that you need all of the data to validate any transactions and to make it possible for others to validate the chain. You can't even prune. So to make that feasible in small locations, keeping it small makes sense, and it will get smaller and smaller with Moore's law. So you could certainly, say, well, we went from 1 meg to 4 meg in Bitcoin, and still linear, big increase, but now people are wringing their hands about it because it's actually probably happening, right? So I don't know what the thinking was. Was this just not going to happen? And people are not going to use this space for cheap stuff because it's cheap space because it's bigger? I don't know. But I try not to, I try not to pretend there's any distinction between spam and financial transactions. They're all just lower fee transactions.
Yeah, agreed.
And if you don't want miners to take lower fee transactions, just put a cap on the amount, right? The fees will be as low as possible. To me, it sounds, that's a simple solution. I see people doing things that are more complicated, but I just don't see any significant reason for making it any more complicated than that. It's you could also do something that's more complicated with the difficulty adjustment, right? It's fixed. It's targeting, roughly 10 minutes. It's churning out these conversations. Why? It could vary it, right? We could make it more complicated. Or the subsidy, we could make it more complicated and try to get some benefit out of it. But from an economic standpoint, I really just don't, I don't see why that's material or significant. It's kind of the way I look at, mining on CPUs or GPUs or ASICs. It's like from a high level, those aren't really the issue.
You got to take a good look at Monero and the overall architecture.
The things that you've mentioned about Monero aren't the things that I have thought would be more interesting. Like the privacy, like for example, having a potentially unbounded block size is to me an anti-privacy concern. Having CPU mined coins is maybe some marginal benefit, but as I explained before, I don't really think that's the significant mining issue. But what I do understand is that the linking of transactions, right? The privacy between inputs and outputs that Monero has worked on. As I mentioned, it's a significant issue in Bitcoin, and I would expect there's some advantages there that I would consider material advantages, right?
Yeah, the only reason I'm talking to you because I know you see that as an issue in Bitcoin, and I do think Monero is doing a good job of solving that. So I wanted to run some of these other aspects of Monero by you just to kind of get your opinion.
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, from an engineering standpoint, like if I was going to take and establish, or a brand standpoint, right, establish some brand around private money, Monero, whatever, I would not have done I wouldn't have made any material changes to mining. I wouldn't have made any material changes to block sizing or to coin emission. Because those things they're just not privacy related, right? They may be trying to solve other problems, but they're overloading the central aspect of what I think of as Monero and its brand is delinking inputs and outputs. Right.
Yeah. I would say its brand is censorship resistant fungible digital cash. It's pretty much the same brand as Bitcoin, but does it better.
Right. I think the idea, right, it's the same principle as Bitcoin, but from the beginning, what I understood was Monero was focused initially on cryptographic solutions to the essentially money laundering, problem, right? How do we break the connections between inputs and outputs? And I still, based on stuff you're telling me, those other things we're talking about aren't, from what I can see,
benefiting the censorship resistance.
They're really not material changes to the censorship model. I mean, if you can, tainting will exist on any coin. You trade with somebody, they know who you are. But the ability to delink that from the next transaction cryptographically, I don't know, Mimblewimble or something, right? Zero cash, zero coin. I don't know, I can't keep track of them. All those things to me are fascinating, and they're like new ideas, new technologies that eventually are going to get somewhere. And I think Monero has done a lot of work in that area. That to me is the most interesting.
But holistic, your book, Cryptoeconomics, the value, what you see as being the value proposition of Bitcoin is a censorship resistance.
Yeah. That's one of the two major aspects of censorship resistance that Bitcoin hasn't done a great job at, right? We have mining centralization, and we've got transaction linking, tainting, and they both need work. I mean, for somebody who knows what they're doing, you can be pretty private in Bitcoin. I mean, the fact that we have various crimes that occur and people get away with them and they disappear, and it does work if you do some ransomware, right? These things do work to the extent that you're able to be careful. And you look at like some of the FBI takedowns, and when you really look under the cover and see what they did, you realize it was just some gumshoe work, right? It wasn't like we were linking transactions or anything. Yeah. The guy had his password on a Post-it note, or had his private keys on a Post-it note next to his computer, and we went in and got it. So I think all that work is good, and for me, I just I want to see that continue to make its way into one or more coins, into Bitcoin. Like the improved privacy on chain is important. There's just so much work going on in layering, right? I don't do any work in it. I really don't have any interest in it. It's not that I don't like it. I just don't have any interest in it. To me, the base money is what matters. And I do think that the trade-offs that are made in layering are not small. They're material trade-offs. And as we've seen, there's centralization issues, there's security issues that are real, and people are starting to really come to grips with. There are other solutions to those problems, and multi-chain solutions is approaches already exist. It's one of the ones that I find interesting. So nobody, as far as I know, even works on that or even thinks about it. So I kind of look at that as where I put my effort on base chain work and making it possible to move between them.
So do you think? I mean, do you think Bitcoin is private enough today to resist being co-opted by the state if people want to use it for those purposes, right? So I know it's just a tool.
People already use it for those purposes. Yeah, I mean,
do you think as a technology does it have enough privacy to?
But it's like asking me in like 1980, is the internet good enough to send email? Fuck yeah. If you're a PhD and you have a lab with a computer center and you can, it's great. I worked at IBM in 1986 and they had internal email called profs. I was like, yeah, email's great. What do you mean you don't use email, right? It wasn't for another 10 years that most people even knew how to use email. So I'm
saying we're looking to use this as a tool to resist state control, right?
And that's what a lot of people do right now.
Right.
It keeps keeping people alive around the world. And like, Myanmar, for example, like how are they funding their revolution? It's their Bitcoin. How do Venezuelans get stuff? A lot of it's Bitcoin. So it works, in the West, it's largely a casino. And
we saw issues like in Canada with the trucker revolt, right? We saw like
exactly right. People got their banking shut down, and they saw, oh shit, we can see there's a reason for Bitcoin, but is it big enough yet?
No, but then the Bitcoin became an issue, right? With them blacklisting addresses and.
That's because they were taking it through a central website, right? People were posting Bitcoin payments through some website to their GoFundMe, and not the GoFundMe, the one that came after. Yeah. So the white market infrastructure doesn't work when you need the Bitcoin. That's kind of the point, right? You need to build up infrastructure that works outside the white market, because when push comes to shove, like I watched that whole thing happen, right? I threw a few bucks at the truckers and it was like, okay, we'll see what happens now. When that happens, it just makes it really obvious that your white market solutions aren't solutions. So Bitcoin, it doesn't solve the problems that we're talking about at the level of banks. Like banking's not going to go away, and lending shouldn't go away, right? That's fucking stupid. But people talking about eliminating fractional reserve and interest, and the only kind of lending is fractional reserve lending. There's no other lending. You lend a fraction of what you have. So it's what banks do. They just do it as, they're doing it as your proxy. They're taking what you have and they're lending a fraction of it. So these things, if people are in Bitcoin for those reasons, they're just severely misguided. You're not going to replace the white market banking system. You don't want to replace, things like lending. And spending so much time and energy building on those systems, those white market systems, or those systems designed, to give people risk-free rate of return, just severely misguided, a waste of capital. That was one of the reasons why I started writing the topics or my wiki, and then I ended up writing the book. And I was like, I wanted to, I just so much wasted capital going after these ideas, and I got sick of explaining them over and over and over and over again. So I just wrote these little wiki, topics in my software repo and would just post them to people, and that became the book because other people were making a book out of it. And I finally decided I should do it. But there's I look at the 98% of what goes on in Bitcoin is wasted. And since I can't control what other people do, I just decided to do it myself. Right? I got time, I got ability, and I have interest. I can just sit here for as long as my body will let me, and just write code for Bitcoin and write about theory, because who's going to stop me? But it would be nice if there was some larger part of the community that was not just focused on chilling their shitcoins or their Bitcoin, right, for price, and trying to, rally people by arguing we're going to tear down the system, which I don't see. I know the code pretty well, and I don't know any line of code that is going to resist the white market, or tear down any systems or stop lending. It's not going to happen.
It's coming from the users.
What's that?
That has to come from the users, right? It's just a tool. It's the people.
It's a tool, and most people vote for their the state. so it's a tool for the other people to opt out, and if things get worse, say like Venezuela, more people decide to opt out, and it becomes more popular and more useful. But we have to build things in a way that are usable when they're not allowed, not just pretend that it's going to be popular enough so they can't stop it. It's ridiculous. If they don't want to stop it, that's fine. But the point of Bitcoin is doing it when it's not allowed.
Do you think the number go up mentality and the incentives that it's driving could essentially defang Monero? So as it gets, the design decisions are more towards number go up than building a tool that's good for resisting state control, and it's a feedback loop, and it becomes stronger, and it becomes larger and larger, gains tremendous network effect as this.
There's a certain
number go up tool, which the government ends up not really caring about, because they could extract the taxes as they need from it, because it's a perfectly traceable.
Yeah. Pay your number goes up, and then you pay your capital gains, which means you really didn't avoid the inflation, right. Because your number went up, your value didn't go up.
Right.
I think of that like in a dollar crash scenario, right? What's your capital gains going to be? Bitcoin, right? And if you're in the white market, you're paying tax on that, so they're still capturing a significant portion of the inflation through that. You just have to say, no, not paying my taxes. Okay, well, now you're black market. So I think there are a number of people that measure like the success of these things based on the number, whether the number go up more, my coin versus your coin. And it is a measure of usage to some extent, but I think it's also just measure of speculation. And what are they speculating on? Speculating on usage, right? Well, say the Feds step up one day in the U.S. and in Europe, and they say, well, this stuff's just illegal. It's money laundering. Well, does number keep going up because now we're able to resist that? No, that's probably going to not help. if you get a Fed coin alternative, a soft fork, a censorship soft fork, which comes from the Feds, that might make the number go up even more.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. And then that becomes the popular Bitcoin.
Right.
Chain.
Well, it's not providing any value whatsoever. So I just try not to focus on those things, right? When I hear stories about people in Myanmar, buying supplies while they're living out in the jungles, fighting their, severely oppressive government, and maybe, throwing out some 3D printed guns, I say, technology is working for individuals, and that's good to see. So, I mean, everybody likes to see the number go up in a sense, because it drives interest. It drove the story, which got me interested in, right? I was ignoring the stuff because I saw DigiCash come and go. I saw it fail, and I couldn't imagine the solution to it. And when I heard about Bitcoin, there had been others, and I was just going, yeah, okay. And then when I finally sat down and read it, I understood. But why did I read it? Because Silk Road made the press, and it was Andy Greenberg, who I actually ran into later and had a nice chat with him, but he's the one responsible for getting me into Bitcoin with his Silk Road article in Forbes. And I don't know if you know him, but he writes for Wired now.
Yeah.
I read his book, and I met him at Cody Wilson's house.
Oh, wow.
Also where I met Peter Todd for the first time, same meeting. I met Cody, Peter, Andy Greenberg, Patrick Straitman. Amir was there. He had invited me down, and Cody and I have remained friends since, and I get to sit on a radio show. I had already read Andy's book, and I sat there with him and talked about it at the bookstore in Austin. It was all great fun, but that all happened because number went up, and I caused this article to get written, and I read it, and that got me involved. But I was involved because I was excited about. I went and read the white paper, and I got excited about what was possible all of a sudden, despite what I had learned about DigiCash in the past. I knew the problem with DigiCash was that it was all centralized around David Choum, right? It was his thing, and he could never really escape that, and therefore it never worked. So to me, that was exciting. It wasn't that, the numbers going up. I should get into this Bitcoin thing. I was like, no, wow, we've got stateless electronic money, first time ever. That's really cool to me. That I could see that as that's an internet style size change, and I want to be part of that.
100%. Couldn't agree more, man. That's how I ended up at Monero. I was a Bitcoin maxi, and then I made my way there because I just thought it was kind of living up to those design goals.
I could see a lot of those people, like yourselves, who've done that. Over a long period of time, I think it all evolves into something else. Look back at the internet. I mean, there were conflicts over different protocol issues and different approaches to things that went on for long. Now they're just completely forgotten. They're not important. I remember local area networking. What was going to be the dominant protocol? Was going to be Banyan Vines or NetWare or NetBio. Okay, it all became TCP. Great, but it changed, and we have IPv6. But
it was just less annoying though. People weren't constantly tweeting about it. They didn't have money to make.
It wasn't Twitter.
They weren't pumping their bags if it was one protocol or the other, right? So it's
these systems didn't exist back then, right? Yeah. Before there was, how would you even know these people existed?
Of course,
you'd have to subscribe to Nerd Magazine and read about it. So the paper one, for those of you at home who are too young to know what I'm talking about. It's a different world, and so we're in this world where we're doing some new technology stuff, and I don't. There's some Bitcoin people who are just severely wound up about anybody doing any other kind of coin, and I don't care. I never cared what people want to do with their own property in their own time, and scamming to steal stuff from people. Yeah, I'm not okay with that. But there's a lot of legitimate efforts to try to solve problems and do things in different ways. I mean, some people look at what I'm doing, like, writing another node implementation in Bitcoin is scammy. Like, I'm like, well, okay, that's fine. You can do whatever you want. And in the old days, you wouldn't have to listen to these people 24/7, right? Like you do now. So that's just the world we live in. But sometimes you just turn it off and just keep working. And I've seen so much of it already in Bitcoin come and go. I mean, Gavin came and went. Mike came and went. I remember having one of my first articles my topics I wrote was a discussion based on a discussion I had with Mike, Mike Hearn, who had decided that the way to secure Bitcoin was to build one big server farm and do all the mining there. Because governments can't stop popular things. And if we make the blocks huge and we mine it all together, it'll be so popular, we won't be able to stop it. And I wrote a topic in my book about this. I'm like, so that was actually, there was a bunch of controversy. And I'm like, these things just go away over time. And so I try not to spend too much time on those type of things. Like when protocol changes, like P2P protocol changes are proposed, or soft forks are proposed, things like I tend to argue these things a little bit here and there, but for the most part, I don't really care that much. So there's a lot of people working on these things. They want to do these things. Great, let's try it out. What I do argue is when there's people promoting things that I know not to be true. Like for example, soft forks are backward compatible. That's just an engineering falsehood. Right? Soft forks are not compatible, just like hard forks are not compatible. The difference is with mining majority hash power, you can force people to follow them, right? You don't need to get 100% on board. You only need to get 50% of the mining hash power on board. Then they're compatible. So this whole user activated soft fork thing, which actually lied to people about, and continues to, about how it's compatible, right? It's a soft fork. It's fine. We'll just activate it whenever we want. I was shocked at how many people actually believe that. I thought it was just something people kind of took as a PR line, but didn't really believe it. But there were actually quite a significant number of people who believed that some small fraction of the economy, or some fraction of the economy, or even a majority of the economy could just deploy a soft fork. And because it's backward compatible, there won't be a chain split. And I saw people who should know better promoting that idea. And that's when I spoke up, right? Because to me, that's fraudulent. And that's going to cause people it's going to cause unexpected results, monetary loss, things like that. And the way I look at it is that in that example, that's a power struggle between exchanges and miners. And why would I pick one over the other? Right? You have a choice in these things. If you want to mine, you can mine, and you can get your hash power in there and vote. And I said that from the very beginning. Anyway, so there's those kind of things that I get involved in or economic arguments that don't make any sense. Like I mentioned a few already. But I didn't like the merits of the Taproot implementation or SegWit. I didn't say anything. I implemented the whole thing. I looked at it. There's some things I don't like about it. I wish I would have implemented it early enough to make a comment about hey, I don't like the serialization. You could have done it better. But for the most part, it's fine. And if it's not fine, like say BIP37, whatever, it gets weeded out over time. So I kind of tag along on Bitcoin because it's just the big one, right? And I know it best because that's where I started. And I also try to generalize the implementation that we have enough that I can adopt things very easily. P2P protocol differences, consensus rule differences, which I mentioned Litecoin, really just a few lines of code different, two lines, right? One swapped out the hashing algorithm, which we already had in our code base because of some wallet stuff script, and changing a constant. And I think it changed to the patch to the time warp bug. That was it. And so through config, you can run the same binary, run two different coins. So if I can I focus on Bitcoin, I make sure that that's always working. But say I could implement Monero without significant changes. Sure, I can do it. I just don't have time right now. but I design with that in mind. Because I look at, this scenario I talked about where you have, some various number of chains that are all sitting behind some wallet and you using the ones that you want and swapping between them. If I can do that in one implementation and run any number of chains from that one implementation, now I've done some good engineering work. Right now, running more than one chain, even if it's like, Bitcoin and testnet, right? Or Litecoin, right? Those are recompiles. Those are separate binaries. That's a lot of overhead and stuff to maintain, both in developing and running. So try to engineer to a future where we can solve some of these problems that I anticipate.
Very good, man. Do you have a minute to jump into the chat, the spaces, to see if anybody wants to throw you a question?
Yeah, sure. I could use a 2-minute bathroom break before we jump into something new, though.
Okay. Thank you so much, man. It would be amazing to have you come down to Monerotopia if that's at all possible.
Monerotopia, where is that? It's in New York.
We're doing it in Mexico City in May.
Mexico City in May. Well, I've spent a lot of time in Mexico City.
Amir will probably be there. Other people from the Dark Five project are going to be down there. We're trying to get Peter Todd down there.
It's not out of the question.
Awesome. All right, maybe I could convince you all.
I like Mexico City.
Awesome. Yeah, it's beautiful.
All right. So what should I do with the thing?
It's as simple as, I think you're already logged in there, so I'm just going to add you as a co-host, invite to co-host. So I'm sending you the invite right now, and then you can just accept it, and we'll be done over here. I'll just close it out over here. All right, guys, as we're waiting for Eric to come back, who wants, Aeon's requesting, let's see. Anybody else want to come up, just request to be a speaker? Aeon, what's going on, man?
Not much. I'm always got something to say. I was just seeing if anyone else is going to come up first.
I always love hearing your takes, man. So I'm curious to see this little interaction between you and Eric. This is going to be fun. Anybody else want to jump up? Just come up now, and we'll kind of line people up so Eric can answer a few questions. Hey, what was kind of your overall take there from the conversation? Were you listening in?
Yeah, listen, I mean, Eric's pretty much, I learned half of what I know from him, so it's not too much new, but his work really changed my perspective on looking at these networks and how, thinking adversarially and threat models and all that, so.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how we could get him to take a closer look at Monero, Indigo, what's going on, man?
Hey, Douglas. Thank you for having me up. I am sorry. I seem to be coming into these spaces after the interview, and I don't know what you guys were talking about, or I don't know what was said in there, but from the title, I don't know what you guys touched on. I'm sorry. But I was wondering if Eric would be interested, if he's done any research on Mimblewimble and what that could potentially mean for Bitcoin, at least not perfect privacy, but some fungibility. As well as, I don't know if you guys touched on ordinals and how that might actually showcase or highlight the fact that Bitcoin has been non-fungible. So yeah.
Yeah, no problem, man. Yeah, we did touch on ordinals a bit, but Eric, you want to jump in and answer the Mimblewimble question? Do you have any familiarity with the Mimblewimble and whether or not that might be something that Bitcoin looks to implement?
Hi, yeah, I just caught the tail end of that. I've done no work, looked at nothing closely. I think my exposure to Mimblewimble was when Polstra presented on it and at Scaling Bitcoin in Milan. A long time ago, and sounded very exciting, but I don't know if we could have the effects of completely delinked transactions and provability sounds great. Hopefully the smart guys that work on that kind of stuff keep us moving in that direction. I don't know. I can't really answer the question. I don't know the specifics about where things are these days.
The only thing I'll say about it is it's been launched on Litecoin for a number of months now. And I think that there's about $3 million worth of Litecoin on there. It's only on Core, no mobile wallet, but it's not perfect privacy, like I guess Monero, but it does add confidential transactions. I don't know if I'm sure you do, but it kind of coin joins all the coins. It also does add some scalability, but anyways, thanks for having me.
And then his second comment was about ordinals of regards to affecting Bitcoin's fungibility. I don't know if you want to comment on that again, or if you kind of said your piece there already.
Yeah. To me, fungibility is really not the issue. It's just, block space is cheap and people are going to fill it. And there's really no way you're going to ever distinguish between legitimate and non-legitimate use. Really not worth trying. It seems like the Taproot folks didn't anticipate this, which obviously looks like an oversight, but in the end, the decision was made to 4x the block size and discount the witness data. And this should be expected from that, right? And I think that's been the response of a lot of long-term core developers. I mean, some response has kind of been split between, it shouldn't happen, we got to find a way to stop this, to, which is going to happen. This is the consequences of increasing the block size. So to me, that's not something to really have a strong opinion on. And the lack of privacy, as I mentioned before, in Bitcoin is the root cause, not people putting some pictures on the chain or doing whatever they want with it, right? If you can't delink inputs and outputs, and you have if it's easy to taint, then it's a problem no matter what you put in the transactions.
All right. Aeon, you want to throw out your question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Eric, I just want to say thanks for the work you do, because it changed my perspective a lot on these systems and gave me a really lucid view of how they work and just the basic understandings of these systems and what they're capable of and what they're attempting to do. So thanks for your work, because I know you work hard on it and you're out there trying to speak some rationality into the void, but
well, thanks for the
there's
feedback.
people that appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback, and I just asked, like you said, it's changed your perspective on those things, and in what way?
Just in how I look at these networks, and especially between white market and black market, like those concepts fundamentally, like there was one time you were saying, Bitcoin's perfectly fungible in the black market. The problem is with white market, and technically nothing's really fungible in the white market because the state or the permission authority can just make whatever rule they want and say you can't use it unless you
right
identify this entire string of your history and put whatever.
The white market, lack of fungibility, affects black market too, because as I mentioned, the talk, one of the reasons to accumulate money, earning savings in black market is to use it in the white market. So you have this transition that goes both ways, and it necessarily so, and it's pretty significant. And that's really it's that you can look at money laundering in a number of ways. One is it's just privacy, or two is it's transitioning between black market and white market use of your money, right? But if you're being infected in the white market, lack of fungibility, that will affect how people see their money in the black market too, unless they can make that transition transparently. And that's again why we talk about delinking of transactions.
The other aspect was, about 51% of tax, and just the state being the censor. And in regards to that and fee pressure, I mean, in that scenario, especially with Bitcoin, because white market miners will still be able to make fees on transactions where people choose to, abide by whatever the state is requesting. And so the fee pressure with the black market transactions and the battle between black market miners and white market miners, have you ever thought of because the only people that are going to be able to put fee pressure on or I should say incentive to the black market miners are transactions that are blacklisted. And so not everyone's going to have a blacklisted transaction. So the people that don't kind of just sit around and hope that the blacklisted transactions bump their fees enough to incentivize the black market miners. And from what I've thought of, there's no way to pool the fee pressure unless you go out of your way to get your UTXOs tainted before any kind of 51% attack happens.
Yeah, it's touching on some good observations. It's I come out with I put down the theory, right? That if anything's going to pay for people to mine illegally, and mining is the only way we're going to without creating a new coin, giving up and starting over again. Mining is the way you overcome majority hash power attack, and mining is paid for by fees, unless it's just charity. And so really it's a very simple idea that getting the transactions confirmed has to be valuable enough for people to pay for it, or they won't. And that value is presumably because they want their black market transaction confirmed, or they want it confirmed for whatever reason, and they're going to pay extra for it versus a censored, a non-censored transaction, approved transaction. And so the point you're raising is, well, how does that actually happen, right? How do a group of people who have transactions they want,
or how do more people participate? Because if I got a bunch of UTXOs and none of them are blacklisted, I can't get them blacklisted. Really,
you can raise your fee
because but if they're willing to mine it and it's a white market transaction, then I'm not adding to the incentive to overtake them.
What you asked was
you
asked how do I participate? And by participate, it means, I think what you're saying is, how do I pay more money to these black market miners? And it's very simple. You just put your fee above. You want to have I get what you're saying. You want to have a transaction that the white market miners aren't going to capture your fee. It's only going to be available to the black market miners.
Yeah.
Oh,
exactly.
You do something that makes your transaction black market, I guess. That's a good question.
Yeah, but you'd have to do it beforehand because, that really is irrelevant. But yeah, you'd have to do something that intentionally taint them, or
do something that's
because the more people that could participate in that fee pressure, the better chance it is to push out the censor.
Right, but ultimately, what you're saying is you want to donate to the cause.
Yeah,
and I don't put a lot of stock in charitable solutions. I think really there has to be real economic need for something to really be sustainable economically. Sustainable, period, right? So if people are like, well, we'd like to preserve this black market money even though we don't really need it, well, probably not going to survive. Just on charity. The state, is mining at a loss if those fees are rising. And it's paying for that with taxes. And taxes aren't charity, it just extracts them from people, right? So it could be that people don't see it as charity, right? They're fighting the man, but I think if Bitcoin is going to survive, it's going to have to do so on its economic value to people. Not donations.
Can I kind of interrupt and kind of interject there? That's quite an interesting statement, Eric.
Sure.
Like if Bitcoin's going to survive, it's kind of you think there are certain rules behind Bitcoin, as in like deterministic rules that kind of will make it survive?
Nothing guarantees Bitcoin will continue to, I mean, by surviving, what do we mean? Somebody's using it, right? But we're talking about is making it usable when it's not allowed for people, So there's two approaches. One is the state censors directly the use of the, the acceptance of the money. So every white market business, every tax-paying business in the country decides they can no longer accept it. And then you've got the other approach, which is, well, that's not good. And that would presumably come first, right? And that's not good enough. So we need to 51% attack it so that nobody else can use it either. So by survival, we mean, in the face of those things, do people still have the ability to use it in the black market? Well, in the face of a kind of merchant prohibition, yeah, of course they would. The transactions are still getting confirmed. In the face of a 51% attack, that may not be the case, right? You may not get any transaction confirmed that doesn't, you don't provide ID for at a bank somewhere. So the question is, how do you overcome that? And that's what I mean by survival, right? If it's not surviving because nobody cares, that's a different problem, right? There's nobody using it. But if it's not surviving because the state is 51% attacking it, and people can't really use it for anything but approve transactions, which means there's no value proposition. And by the way, the state can effectively compel inflation at the same time, even without hard forking. They can just charge you extra fees. And so it becomes a demurrage money, and effectively nullifies the anti-signage benefit too. So with a 51% attack, it's not really surviving. It's not providing the value proposition. That's what I mean. And how do you prevent that? Well, somebody's got to pay for it, and presumably, if nobody can transact a certain number of these transactions for some period of time, the value of them getting confirmed is going to increase and increase and increase. And somehow those people, and this is what I was saying, it's a good question. How do people kind of make that happen? One approach is just to submit replacement transactions, child pays for parent transactions, right? Keep increasing their fees on transactions, and those fees are just sitting out there, just waiting for somebody to take them. And that rising pool of fee potential it's just sitting there it just grows and grows and grows and grows, presumably, until somebody comes along and says, I'm going to take that chance. I'm going to put together a shit ton of hash power and grab all that money. But that has to be more than the state is willing to lose in tax money.
That's kind of, you've touched on quite a few interesting points there, and so kind of generally speaking, let me ask you kind of like a broad question. Kind of, do you think there's a lot of game theory going on with Bitcoin in terms of what you just said? In terms of, so my personal perspective is Bitcoin it's the ultimate kind of culmination or manifestation of a non-zero two-person game. And what you kind of just touched on there is kind of saying that people don't really trust each other, but we have this mechanism now where, as far as I can tell, the values behind Bitcoin or the rules behind Bitcoin, they're not arbitrary. Kind of the pseudonymity behind it, or the kind of anonymity or pseudonymity, however you want to kind of like dramatically define it, it provides for a kind of like symmetry where there's equality in bargaining skill, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's equal. But what it does potentially provide is a mechanism where everyone can be better off. Or if you take the game as a whole, there's welfare. So I kind of followed you on Twitter a little bit, Eric, and I think we might have had like a few kind of spats over time, but I don't know what I've just said there, whether that kind of resonates with you at all, or whether you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, touching on the idea of game theory and rules and everything. I'm not a big fan of the game theory interpretation of Bitcoin, mainly because, well, I haven't seen a game theoretic model that applies to Bitcoin. I mean, this is a formal mathematics, right? It's not just like ad hoc ideas. I made an attempt to apply the prisoner's dilemma type model to Bitcoin because people were talking about it a lot, and I couldn't. There's certain criteria that the model has to that have to exist for that particular game to apply, and that's true of all kind of games and game theory. That these are not useful unless they apply, not usable unless they apply, and they have to apply. So I haven't seen that yet. I hear people talking about it a lot. I challenge people to produce a valid game theoretic model. Games are different than economy, right? The economy of the world of people trading with each other and using money, as a medium of exchange, is not a game in the sense of game theory. Games are very closely controlled. Who has access to what information, what are their motivations, how many players are there, what are the rules? And you mentioned rules a number of times, and the rules of economy is everybody does whatever they want, right? And what do they want? Who knows what they want, right? We don't know what they want, and it's not like with a prisoner's dilemma, we can presume, that they don't want the punishment and they do want the reward. That's why those terms are given to those rules, right? We make it up. So under those assumptions, we can then draw these conclusions. In economics, right, we don't know why somebody values something. We assume people value time. That's time preference. That's an assumption. That's an axiom. We assume people value more over less of the same thing, right? And we assume the more they have of that same fungible thing, the less they value each additional unit, right? These are kind of the inherent assumptions of economics, but value is subjective. We don't know. And so really trying to place any formal type of rule system on top of that, it's difficult, to say the least. I've tried it. And the way I look at it is it's a competitive market, right? There's people that are trading, and I want to sell my thing for the most I can get for it, and the other person wants to buy it for the least they can get for it. And that's always the case in all trades, we assume. Because of the assumption in economics, people want more than less. And when it comes to threats against Bitcoin, we talk about the state and their ability to mine 51% attack, that kind of thing. We assume the state has, as a primary interest, its goal of preserving its tax power through signage and through transparency. And the reason I make that assumption is because that's the value proposition I ascribe to Bitcoin. It's the opposite, right? So Bitcoin wants to allow people to pay less tax, right? Less in signage and less in transaction taxes, because it hides the transactions, right? So privacy of transacting and soundness of the money, right? In other words, it's a market-produced money, not a monopoly-produced money, provides those advantages. And of course, because that's what Bitcoin is trying to give to people, it's what the state wants to prevent. That's the assumption we operate under. And okay, well, the state wants to prevent these things, and it has to protect its own money, it can use tax. What's the limit on its ability to tax? Well, the limit on its ability to tax is, rebellion, ultimately. Like, when people finally break out the pitchforks in defense of Bitcoin, right? In defense of not paying the tax anymore. But people being taxed to the hilt to subsidize a mining hash power attack against Bitcoin, presumably there is a limit, but that might be very, very high. Now, what kind of game theory model is going to tell me where that is and when that stops? Right?
Yeah, that's kind of, yeah. What you're saying is is interesting, and So first of all, sorry, excuse me. You kind of mentioned the prisoner dilemma game theory idea earlier. So Satoshi didn't directly, I don't think, as far as I'm aware, he didn't directly kind of talk about prisoner dilemma game theory, but he did say that the Bitcoin proof of work solves the Byzantine generals problem, which, as far as I can make out, prisoner dilemma games and the Byzantine generals problem are the same thing in terms of if you're in a kind of cooperative. Sorry, if you're in a non-cooperative game or a competitive game with someone, as in you're competing with someone, and it's kind of zero sum, I'm going to win, you're going to lose, then the one thing that you rely on in playing such a game is true information, as in you want to know what the other person knows, kind of thing. So that's kind of touches on prisoner dilemma games, and as far as I can make out, that's the same thing as the Byzantine general problem. In terms of you, like a Byzantine general will want to know what the other kind of general on the other side of the argument,
Well, there's
what information they have access to.
but there's some
That's kind of the idea behind the blockchain, as far as I can make out. And the blockchain is based on a series of assumptions. That's my opinion of it. And that's my outlook of it. I don't know what you think to that.
Well, I mean, there are some game theoretic models that assume perfect knowledge, and there's others that assume no knowledge, right? Like all the players know what all the information that every player has, and all of them don't. I actually looked at both approaches when I analyzed Prisoner's Dilemma as a potential, but you know these models are also applied in different scenarios. Like what I was looking at was the argument that states must all eventually adopt Bitcoin, you know, or they will have some failure. Right. In other words, it's game theoretically provable that they will all states will eventually adopt Bitcoin. I couldn't make any model along those lines valid in terms of game theory. They're open-ended, whether it was full information or no information about what each other has. So on the other hand, the relationship between Byzantine generals, kind of problem and the prisoner's dilemma, I've never heard that. There may be some relationship, but I don't think of the Byzantine generals problem in terms of game theory. It's a problem. How do we make this conclusion with untrustworthy information, right? Across all these disparate people in different locations. How do we come to a conclusion?
Yeah.
We can't trust the messenger.
So that's
the solution to that.
Yeah, that's quite interesting.
Bitcoin is just we just make them do a bunch of work, and the answer is probabilistic. That's it. We all agree to accept as knowledge the most work that we see. So I don't know what the game theory, how we would apply game theory to that.
Well, I mean, what you just said there. Bitcoin is a probability-based system.
We get eventually.
Yeah, you're saying quite a few you're saying quite a few interesting things there that I don't necessarily disagree with. But on the other hand, personally, I think Bitcoin is based in game. I think Bitcoin was the work of a game theorist.
Well, I've heard that theory many times, but I have yet to ever see a game theoretic model applied to Bitcoin. So if that's your theory, I would either find one or write one up, publish it, and submit it to like a game. It would be probably a valuable contribution, submit it to a journal of mathematics that specializes in game theory, and have people that actually understand that stuff better than I do review it. But nobody's done that as far as I know. And despite all the talk that people have about it, and there's a lot of people that think Nash invented Bitcoin because of this connection, which I have yet to see. Yeah. I read everything that Nash wrote about Bitcoin, or things related to Bitcoin, and it's all very, very high level. And
you've read his ideal money papers and his ideas on coalition formations.
Yeah. There's not that much that pertains to money, and to me, it's all very kind of I've said before, kind of simple and naive. it assumes the ideal money thing just assumes that states will be compelled to act in a certain way against their own interest because of the power of a useful measure, and it's circular in its argument, right? The idea that state monies will peg themselves to an ideal money, a gold-like money, right, like Bitcoin, presumes that the money they're pegging it to is the money that people are using. Because how could you peg it to money people aren't using? It would be useless, right, to peg it to it. But it also presumes that people are using the state monies, not the other money. So how is that not circular, right? It doesn't make any sense to me. Either everybody's using the Bitcoin, and that's what you actually use, and therefore your state monies are pointless, or everybody's using the state monies and Bitcoin is useless as a peg. It can't be both.
I got a quick question. Even if it was proven like, okay, Bitcoin's a game theoretical system, what benefit would that serve to, like, the threat models and the adversarial aspects to the system? Like,
well, if you could prove it was, if you provide a game theoretical model, you could prove something. You could actually prove something. But that's not what people mean when they say game theoretic in Bitcoin. It's more of a hand-wavy idea that there's competition going on, which doesn't allow you to prove anything.
Yeah, I think, okay, so that's a good question. Sorry, my screen's kind of jumping around. So is it Aeon who just asked that question about?
Yeah. I'm just wondering what benefit it would serve. Like.
Yeah, so from a Nash perspective, Nash's kind of idea is, or behind idle money, it was more of a microeconomic kind of idea than a macroeconomic idea. So what he was essentially saying is if you can mitigate the pernicious effects of inflation in a monetary system, then you can consider contracts in terms of how that contract is considered, and that was kind of the idea. And so getting back to the game theory, the idea would be is that if you start to introduce contracts into human interaction, and the way the money unit or the way the contract is expressed in terms of the money unit, then you begin to turn games from a non-cooperative idea into a cooperative idea. And he had this idea of modelling coalitions, and I think he kind of reached this conclusion that you couldn't kind of politically implement it, but you could kind of just gradually over time just kind of change things by changing the kind of way people understand money. So it's quite deep subject matter, and it's quite a difficult thing to kind of put in a nutshell. But that was kind of that was the idea.
Already done that.
Sorry, say that again. Sorry.
So in that case, wouldn't it have gold already accomplished that?
Oh, right. Yeah. So that's a good point. So years ago, there was something called like a gold standard or a gold clause, where people would kind of put a gold clause into contracts to kind of get away from the inflationary or deflationary effects of currencies. But then I think it was the 1930s, America kind of abolished the gold standard or made it illegal. But I think Satoshi was like a gold nut, and I know that.
Hold on, I'm sorry, but the point I think it was Aeon was making is that gold existed, was used as a contracting system. What you're saying is correct. That the gold was gold clauses existed in contracts for money, and the U.S. government, along with others, outlawed the contracting in gold for decades, and that should be self-evident from that history that what Nash is saying, right, about this ideal money, which people used at the time, people used gold as their ideal money. That was the ideal against which the others were measured. All of the state monies were pegged to gold, and gold was used as a unit of account. It was contracted with, and so this idea that would compel states to not inflate their currency is what I meant when I said naive, right? It already happened, right? We already had this, and states, instead of getting closer to gold, the whole reason they created state monies in the first place was to collect the gold and then tax through their money, right? So they ended up with the gold, and they taxed through seigniorage, right? Through monopoly control of the printing press. So the opposite of what Nash suggested actually did happen, right? The deviation from the norm is what happened, and it was enforced through currency controls around the world, and continues to be enforced through currency controls around the world. So it's not like this didn't happen, right? This did happen, and it does still exist, right? That possibility still exists. So to my answer right off the bat to his, the proposal that some ideal money would compel states to move to that money and therefore surrender their tax power in the money was extremely naive. All states have to say is no, no, we're not going to do that. We like our tax power.
Yeah, it sounds like to me, to put it simply, is that it's an assumption that the state will value ideal money over over their monopoly money.
Well, it's an assumption. I think, I don't know, I never met the man, but from what I've read about Nash, he's not like a libertarian, right? You might read some of his money talk and get that from him, but he's very much, a traditional kind of statist of the 20th century. Not being judgmental about it. That's just who he is. And a lot of his statements and arguments were in support of the state, being able to defend itself against other states, right? And the state defending its money would go right along with that. So in other words, the point I'm trying to make is that he tends to take a very kind of a naive view of the state itself, right? Like, it will do the right thing. If it had a good money to model its money against, it would do that. It would not steal people's savings. The reality is, and I don't think he really understands this, is that the purpose of state money is to take people's savings. That's why it exists. It's so that they can tax and not do it transparently. And if he understood that, I think he would realize that his argument doesn't hold any water, because it's not like the state is missing a good peg to peg against. And if it just had that, it could stabilize its currency. It doesn't want stable currency. It wants a continually inflating currency, which is what every single state money is around the world, even though it doesn't have to be. You can just peg to gold. Right, that was the argument in the first place. You could just peg to gold, and of course, if they had done that, it would have stayed stable.
Yeah. They value the monopoly over that, so it makes.
Are you kind of saying then that the whole thing is a conspiracy?
No, I'm just saying that the state uses money.
It's a value judgment.
The state uses money to tax. That's why it has state money. That's why it exists. If it didn't want to tax through its money, it would just let private companies make their own monies and not be involved in money. It's not like private society doesn't have the ability to devise standards of weights and measure, right? So,
what you're saying is, I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying. It's quite interesting what you're saying, and thanks to the audience.
No worries. Thanks for feedback.
Hey, to jump back to the 51% attack thing and the fee pressure. It's kind of an arbitrary question, but what came to my mind is another method is people, extremists, maxi extremist types, sabotaging white market miners, like sabotaging their farms because of the 51% censorship. I could see that happening as a potential, along with fee pressure.
Well, yeah, open combat's always a solution.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. That's what it's essentially what you're talking about is taking up arms against the censor, which is an option. I think the kind of idea behind Bitcoin is that there's this tool that allows us to hide better, right? Like how do you hide financial transactions electronically? It's really hard. Well, now there's a better tool, which means less direct conflict, right? But if you just want to get your freedom back through eliminate the taxation, you can always set up the barricades and break out the pitchforks. That's the tried and true, historical standard.
Yeah, and also like in that 51% attack scenario, the black market miners have a lot more risk. Like that risk sharing really doesn't level out for the black market miners, because one, they're risking getting their, putting that hash rate together and then mining a block and then realizing they're not majority and getting orphaned instantly. But then they're also risking, being raided by, some government agency. So
Well, that's
the risk really piles on.
That's true in any black market, and that risk is priced in, right? And any black market is going to have you're going to experience a price premium, for operating at risk of state attacks, and that price premium will be paid for by fees, or it won't be, or the service won't be provided. I mean, there's certainly, you can imagine there are probably some illegal things that don't get provided by the market because they would be too expensive for most people to pay for, right? So they don't get provided, and that's true of any good, right? There's some, like I want to go to Mars and I want to pay $10, but nobody's providing that service because it's too expensive. Right? I can't get it at that price. So it may be if providing the service is too expensive, this premium you're talking about is too high, then people won't pay it and they won't have Bitcoin transactions, right? And that's what we mean with survival. But the fee differential, the difference between the going market fee for censored and uncensored transactions, is the premium that is being paid and therefore collected by black market miners. And what you're suggesting is that premium may not be high enough for them to do it, and that is of course true. It may be high enough, but how big is that premium? That premium will continue to rise until one of two things happens. It's too high and people they won't pay anymore for the transaction confirmation. Or remember the premium is what the state is losing in their mining subsidies to mine lower. They're basically mining transactions with lower fees than is justified by the hash rate. So that's the loss they're taking. So either people don't want to pay the fee anymore, or the state doesn't want to subsidize their attack anymore. One of those two things happens. So what you're doing is you're looking at a comparison between these two numbers. How much is the state willing to tax every 10 minutes to pay for their hash rate subsidy, versus how much are people willing to pay as a premium, not their total fees, but their premium on their fees, to get those transactions confirmed. I mean, you look at it that way, it looks kind of bleak.
That puts it really
right?
clear, like you usually do. So it makes perfect sense. Because there's a premium on darknet markets because people have risk,
right.
And they add the risk into the price.
You'll be able to measure that premium under a Bitcoin 51% attack just by access to the public transaction pool. Right? You take a look at the transaction pool and you see transactions clearing at 100 satoshis per byte or something, right? And you see other transactions not clearing, and the average. So you add it all up, and you can look at, okay, I could mine this block, that block, that block, and you realize that the difference between the reward and the blocks that are getting mined versus the reward and the blocks that are not getting mined that you could mine is say it's $100,000, dollars, or say $10,000 per block difference. That could be taken if you wanted to mine. Now, okay, that's $60,000 per hour times $24 per day. That's the difference between those two reward levels. Now, if I just break out the spreadsheet and go, okay, how much hash rate do I need to get to be able to overcome their 51% and to capture these rewards? And presumably, it would be worth it because those rewards pay for the hash rate, right? So the question then becomes, well, does the state continue to increase its subsidy as I apply my hash rate and I still can't win? And then do fees continue to rise as I apply, as I attempt to do this? That's what I'm talking about. This difference will be very visible. You just look at the total reward I mean, the total fee reward in confirmed blocks versus potential blocks, and you can be able to publish this number, and all these potential miners are going to sit there and go, it's either worth it or it's not worth it.
So then, kind of there, you're getting into like social group theory.
I'm just looking at, it's just economics, right? There's always demand for some product out there, right? Like I said, I want trips to Mars. There's demand. There's a lot of people that go
rewarding people.
There'd be a lot of people that go to Mars, and there's other people that are entrepreneurs that are sitting out there going, how much will it cost me to take somebody to Mars? And Musk is probably out there going, okay, I can make it work, right? Right. But up until now, there hasn't been anybody willing to do that because they're going to lose money. So nobody has enough money to be able to support that. So there are products that just don't come to market. But I know you're trying to look at this as a kind of a game theoretic thing, but this is just the market. Every product follows this market dynamic.
Eric,
So
John, hold on a sec. Hold on a sec. So Eric, in this, this basically this model that you're talking about, or what inevitably the battle's going to be, like I had brought up in the talk. I mean, do you think that it's going to lead to governments trying to obtain unrealized capital gains on Bitcoin because of that, as an incentive to kind of put things in their favor?
Not sure I follow your question.
Well,
I mean, I know what unrealized capital gains are. You're saying that the government will force you to realize those gains and then tax you for it?
yes. Well, the government knows who you are, how much Bitcoin you have, and given the transparent nature of Bitcoin, will be able to easily assess that and then, ask for their pound of flesh.
Well, they haven't asked for unrealized capital gains on anything else. Well, I mean, in the U.S., for example, an unrealized capital gain could be also called a property tax, right? I have some land, and every year I pay $10,000 for the right to have the land, and it's based on the valuation. So it's I don't know, similar, right? Taxing you on your property, and some countries do tax on your property, and fine. I mean, I wouldn't put that beyond the possibility of any government to tax to employ essentially property taxes. But again, we're talking about the difference between white and black market, right? White market people pay their tax, or they become black market people. Black market people, why would they bother paying the tax? If you're saying like one can't avoid being white market because there's no privacy, then we're just left with the status quo. That's the way the existing financial system works.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at there.
And when you're talking about capital gains, I think you're assuming gains, right? Money doesn't really. Money has capital gains associated with it. It's some other state's money. Your state will tax you that difference, but money doesn't really have gains. Money fluctuates relative to other money in terms of its purchasing power, but it doesn't have yield, right? So there's no reason to assume gains. You got just as much assume losses as gain. It's not like.
I got one more quick question. I'm wondering, Eric, if you have any knowledge on the history of the invalidate block command that they put in Bitcoin Core and why they put it in there. And I've heard people, even Adam Back say, after if there's a censor, we'll just call invalidate block and invalidate their blocks. And I'm like, well, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of the system.
Well, that was, but I'm not familiar with the specifics in their code of that, but I know what it is. And, it's similar to just saying, creating a checkpoint, but you would have to actually mine a block you want on a different chain to make it work with the checkpoint. So you can say this is an invalid block, and of course it hard forks you off onto another branch. That doesn't really. It's what you're saying, right? It eliminates Bitcoin. This was the prevailing.
Yeah,
this was the prevailing theory on censorship resistance in Bitcoin up until I proposed that it was based on fees. right? That it was. You go back in Bitcoin Dev, and I even had some discussions with people about this, early on. And the argument was always that the way you deal with the 51% attack is you hard fork. It was the only answer. Nobody had another answer. Satoshi didn't have another answer. I think he proposed somewhere that people could donate to the cause, right? Economically kind of irrational solution. So, I'm proposing that the only economically rational solution without abandoning Bitcoin is fees. When you hard fork Bitcoin to, by introducing a new rule, you've created a new coin, and the trick is getting everybody to follow you to that new coin. Well, the you is the important part, the person who makes that decision, right? Now, the whole point of mining in Bitcoin is that we can collectively come to eventual consistency and agree on that question. If we're no longer using mining to agree on that question, we've basically eliminated Bitcoin. Now we're relying on proof of Twitter or some other thing, right? We basically don't have a solution to the Byzantine generalist problem anymore. So that's one big part of it, is it eliminates the solution. We're back to where we started, and eventually it devolves into some other consensus system. Like, how do we come to agreement on, is it Blockstream that publishes the weekly block? But then we're down to, even though we've done this, what prevents the miners from just, the 51% attacker from just switching over to the new chain and doing it again. So every block we'd be left with a new decision to make on who to follow for the next block. And this has actually happened with various shit coins, where they've had to go on and publish a block and then publish another one and publish another one, right?
Yeah, I know BSV went through it.
Yeah,
and it was proof of Twitter.
It was
every week,
and it was exactly what I said. What would happen if Bitcoin did that? But because there was no other answer, that was the answer. That was the standard answer. Back like 7 years ago or so.
Was that why they put that flag in there? Because I know it wasn't in there originally.
No, I mean that was. There'd be no other reason to add that except to facilitate a community-wide hard forking to another chain, right? We're just basically going to say the censor has just published this block. We're going to reject it, which will allow non-censors to compete. Okay, but everybody has to do that at the same time, right? Or everybody has to do it, right? And they all have to agree on it. What if somebody says, no, I'm going to do this block, we'll do that block, and what we can, how do we know that the block that was just mined was a censor block or a non-censor block? I mean, we can look and we can try to inspect the contents, but how do we know what the fees are that are actually being paid? For example, if we had a very low fee block, we might assume it's a censor block, right? It's much lower fees than the rest, but maybe that miner is getting paid on the side, which is perfectly legitimate, right? They're getting paid for the space. The reason fees are in transactions is because it makes it easy to publish the fee to anybody who mines the transactions. In other words, anonymously or pseudonymously. If you're paying somebody on the side, you don't really have that mechanism to pay anybody anonymously, but it's still legitimate. You're still paying for the space. It's not censorship or anything like that. So, miner can mine their own transactions, put no fees on them. Miner can mine some, exchanges transactions, put a low fee on it and get paid back some other way. It doesn't matter. So in other words, it's very hard. It's basically impossible to look at a block and say, this is a low fee block or not low fee block. So you're gonna have to do some kind of semantic evaluation and find out, well, if this is a block that we all as a community decide we should reject. Can you imagine, this becomes the norm, and everybody's like, no, this is a good block. It's got my NFTs in it, But so all of a sudden we're having a Twitter war over which the next block to block to reject, right? So yeah, it's kind of a really silly idea when you think about it, but it is, it does have that legacy of being the only answer until we realize that fee differential is what's going to do it. And if you're really going to change to a new chain, you can't just invalidate the block. You have to invalidate the mining algorithm, right? You have to basically
which punishes everyone, including the non-censors.
Whether or not you're
you'd have to kind of change the rules of the consensus.
Well, you are changing the rules of the consensus as soon as you publish an invalid block. As soon as you say this valid block is not valid, You've changed the rule. You've added a new rule. The new rule is that block's invalid. And now you need to add another rule to prevent the 51% of the mining power from just switching to your new chain, which they can do trivially. So you publish another rule, which basically changes the hashing algorithm. So maybe change one bit something, but now the hardware is no good. So now everybody's got, everybody's on a level playing field, and the hardware, builds up again. So who has a better ability? By the way, this is all in my book, Wiki Topic on the subject called
your analysis is very interesting, I've got to say, and
well, the question is,
it's good stuff.
Is if you invalidate the mining hardware, what you've done is you've foisted a capital loss on all miners, right? They've all lost that investment. But the question is, who's going to come back? Who's going to tool up? The good miners or the bad miners, right? So what I argue is that the larger miners are more profitable. We talked about that earlier, Monero talk. And the ones that are more profitable have better access to capital, larger operations, more savings, right? They're the ones that are going to retool and come back. And the small ones, the ones that you wiped out for the second, third, fourth time, they're not coming back. And I actually put this to a test. I asked one of the largest miners in the world. We were in a panel together, and I just leaned over and I asked him, "What would you do if there was a hard fork and we changed the mining algorithm?" He's like, I just retool and I'll be back within a week, whatever. Like he would come right back. Otherwise, he wouldn't be deterred by that. And you imagine your garage miner or whatever, your small time miner, they get wiped out by that a few times. They don't have the capital to keep doing that. And governments, of course, would be the last ones to be wiped out because they have tax money. So it doesn't make sense. You're wiping out the wrong people, and you've broken the entire Bitcoin model around, consensus solving, solving the Byzantine generals problems. You don't have the consensus system.
Yeah, I think it's chain.
Yeah.
It's
So
no, it's good. It's good stuff. Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, when it comes right down to it, you have to, if you're, these things might happen, right? It could happen maybe once or twice, whatever, but it can't be the solution to this question. It has to be based on economics, and that has to be based on fees, and that has to be based on demand. And ultimately, that's one of the things I work towards. I want to work towards a system that can operate in that kind of hostile environment and allow people to solve that. The problem we were talking before about how do people collaborate to kind of increase their fees. Well, this should actually happen. This is part of the inherent design of Bitcoin, and Satoshi didn't even recognize it. He didn't recognize that fees naturally increasing with slow confirmations would increase resistance to the 51% attack and be the solution. He never articulated that, and articulated other things like community donation, I think. So it's interesting that it's just inherently already there.
I think he did articulate the majority, the kind of the significance or importance of the majority decision.
Oh yeah.
So
he was well aware of that.
In the white, so in the white paper, he says proof of work kind of solves two problems. One, it avoids fraud or double spending. And then he goes on to describe proof of work as avoiding, it represents, or it overcomes the problem of determination of representation in majority decision making.
Yeah.
So he's kind of talking about how is the majority represented. And
it just solves the coordination problem.
Yeah, and it's not even intended to be the kind of a majority rule thing. That's really not it's not like a vote. It's just that whoever puts the most capital into this, it's not people, right? It's not majority by people. It's majority by cash invested, by the amount of capital put into mining. Yeah. And so that could be one person, it could be one government, right? So it's not like meant to be democratic, but we have this solution to coming to eventual agreement on what the history is without having, while at the same time having everybody at odds with each other, everybody competing with each other, yet still coming to what in computer science we call eventual consistency. like, not trying to keep everything consistent all the time, but reaching consistency pretty quickly and pretty reliably over time.
Isn't that game theory though? That's kind of how I understand game theory, in terms of how do you reach a kind of an agreed. That's how.
Game theory tells you it's not a process to reach eventual consistency. That's like database programming. How do you take a distributed? When we talk about eventual consistency, we're talking about distributed systems, like often databases, or data on many machines around the world. And how do we keep that data in sync? Well, in the old days, you would actually couple those machines closely and make sure they're always the same. Like in programming, you might have a critical section. Nothing can happen until they're all the same. But modern distributed systems don't work that way, because that just doesn't work at scale. So the way eventual consistency works is changes propagate through the system over time, and eventually those changes get everywhere, but there may be new changes coming. So you may never have actual consistency, but you are always approaching consistency. And that's the way Bitcoin works. There's no guarantee that anybody's ever going to have the same, set of blocks. But over time, we're all going to have kind of like
an asymptote kind of thing, or asymptotically kind of approach.
Exactly, you can think of it that way. We're always approaching the same history, and if there's enough time where nobody has published a new block, we will all have the same history, right? If we've all we've all seen all the information that's published, we haven't missed anything, and there's been some time going by, so the churn is not happening anymore. Worst case scenario in Bitcoin is you have some number of nodes that still differ because they have the exact same amount of work on two different chains. That's still possible, but it probabilistically becomes less and less likely over time.
Yep, exactly.
So we call that eventual consistency. Game theory would say, well, this is the decision that this set of people are going to come to because they're under these pressures and they have these objectives based on these rules.
Yeah. So that's kind of say, when I say game theory, game theory is like a wide, I can kind of just say game theory. It's like game theory in itself has like loads of different branches to it. There's different types of games. Lots of different types of games. It's got different applications. But kind of personally, I just think Bitcoin is the work of a game theorist. But that's like we could talk for days on end on that. But what you said there, Eric, your analysis is
it's classic.
It's pretty precise, and I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. It sounds like we're kind of arguing, but what you're saying is perfectly valid.
Yeah, this is. You could also say that Bitcoin is the work of somebody who had some experience in distributed systems, right? Because this is eventual consistency is a pretty kind of the standard model for database synchronization. And so, that's how distributed systems work in general, right? It's not like that uncommon.
Are you aware of Nash's paper that he wrote in 1954 called Parallel Control? And he basically set out an architecture for a distributed computer network. And the conclusion is that the human brain is a highly parallel setup, and that the human brain is decentralized. But there comes a point where just people will kind of reach an equilibrium or some. Yeah, but I don't know. Have you ever read that Parallel Control?
No.
He wrote it for the Rands Corporation in 1954. But essentially, he's talking about the importance of decentralization within electronic brains.
Sure, it's a heavily studied, subject of, the idea of models of thought and processing power in distributed systems. I met Leslie Lamport. He's a Turing Award winner, but did some work with him. He worked for Microsoft Research when I was there, and I think his aside from being the guy that invented LaTeX, who created LaTeX, he's also kind of a expert PhD world-renowned guru in this idea of distributed systems.
Yeah.
So it's a large discipline, and of course relevance to thought, human mind, all that stuff. But I like I said, when it comes to Nash, I just don't see any connection to Bitcoin at all. He's talked about money, some small amount. I don't know. I don't know why there's such a fascination with it by a small group of people, but it just doesn't seem compelling.
So Nash did write a paper in 1954 called Parallel Control.
Sure.
And it was about decentralization. And then later on, he starts talking about ideal money. And then, so you've got the connection with that to Bitcoin is obviously the decentralized aspect.
There's thousands of papers written on distributed computing. I mean, thousands.
Well, Nash wrote his in 1954. I mean, that was like, most people didn't have television sets in those days. And he's writing papers on distributed or decentralized computer networks. So it is kind of
the only one. I mean, there was a lot of people working in that field. I mean, it was. I mean,
well, there was, I wouldn't say a lot, but there was a few. There was von Neumann and
John von Neumann. Invented game theory, basically, along with just about everything else.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And Turing was investigating models of thought, obviously.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of this stuff, and taking these two thin threads together to try to figure out whether he's Satoshi or not, I think it's kind of silly. He showed no indication that he had the ability to do Bitcoin.
Well, he could code in. He was like coding in C++ at that time, around the time Bitcoin was released.
All right. Well, I really just don't. I honestly don't care who Satoshi is. So.
The point's been made. I mean, maybe he is, maybe he isn't.
Again, don't really care.
Aeon, if you could, Eric, I think we probably have taken up more time than you have to offer. But if we could maybe just close it out, Aeon, if you want to just talk with Eric a little bit about Monero's ASIC resistance and how it uses CPU mining for the purposes of creating a more decentralized, censorship-resistant network. I would just love to have you guys kind of talk a little bit back and forth about that, because I was asking Eric on the show and I feel like I wasn't expressing it well enough, and I'd love to kind of hear Eric's opinion if he understands it a little bit better from you, if you don't mind, Aeon.
I mean, I'm not the best person to ask because I don't know the nitty gritty of the hashing algorithm. I know that, I mean, at one point I thought ASIC resistance was, a fairy tale, because obviously you can optimize any hashing algorithm with, enough time and resources. So, but yeah, I don't really know the nitty gritty on it. I think the analogy I make is that, CPUs are more readily available than ASICs, and they're easier to hide, but that means they're also more readily available to an attacker. So it's hard to say. I mean, the fee pressure is really the bare bones of it. That's kind of, if in the event of a 51% censorship attack, that's really, you have to push the fee pressure.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way I look at it. There may or may not be technical, correctness in these different type of proof algorithms, but fundamentally, they all come down to anybody can mine, which means anybody can get this stuff, and the ability to accumulate some stuff is really not the basis of security. It's economic. It's ongoing cost, right? And presumably, like you said, anybody can get chips. So, and anybody can get ASICs ultimately too. It may not always be the case. It may not be the case right now even. But ultimately, we're just talking about machines, and there's no reason why the black market can't acquire the same machines as everybody else, right? So that to me is not really. There's always been this argument, by people. Actually, I think that largely this came from the same problem we were discussing before, where there was no answer to the 51% attack. There just wasn't a good answer, a rational answer. And so you see, if you look back at old presentations I won't name any names, but people have been presenting and kind of cheerleading on Bitcoin for a long time, doing some great work, but not having an answer to this question. The answer, when people would ask it after reading the paper, would be, well, the amount of capital required to build up mines to compete with Bitcoin is prohibitive, or be too hard to get, it's part of the same problem, too hard to get the specialized hardware, the ASICs, there's not enough in the world, or we can hard fork, right? Those were some of the main arguments to say it was impossible. And all those are, we already talked about the hard forking scenario, why that's so problematic. But this idea that building up 51% hash power costs a huge amount of money is just ridiculous. It's profitable, right? It's happened before. If you have a 51% miner, you're making more money mining than anybody else because you're the largest miner. And as we talked about, on the podcast, the largest miner tends to always be over time the most profitable. So if it's profitable to get there, then execute your tech. What did it cost you? Now, people will say, well, the price would go to zero if somebody attacked Bitcoin. I'm like, well, as we talked about, that's also an assumption that may not hold up. If the government kind of, approves their censored coin and, maintains a hash power attack to enforce it, price may go up. They may profit even more off of that. So that's not a provable solution to the, censorship either. And I think the reason these theories came about because there just wasn't a good answer. I think now that we have, a proper explanation for how the economic model works, we can stop clinging to those ideas, invalidate block and, I've got a bigger mine than you and you could never possibly get a mine bigger than mine as a government who could just walk in and take my mine, right? So yeah, it's another one was jurisdictional arbitrage. Well, you might be able to, stop me from using my Bitcoin here, but I could go to Zimbabwe or the Congo or someplace where they don't care, and I keep doing it. Great, but I can 51% attack you from one place on the earth, which you can't do to gold, right? That's a weakness that Bitcoin has that gold doesn't have. You can't attack it centrally from one place on the earth. So we have an answer to that question, an economically sound, rational answer that most people seem to understand. What I think concerns them once they understand it is that it may not be good enough. And I never tell people this, I never ever tell people.
That's where they get the hang up.
Yeah, it would never tell people that it's good enough. It may be good enough. And what was going to make it good enough is the value that people put in their transacting, in confirming these unapproved transactions. If it's just white market money, like every other money, it's not valuable for me to prove. If it's just like I want, programmable money, yeah, you'll get that with your CDBCs, right? That's not a value proposition for Bitcoin, programmable money, not in any way. The value proposition, because that will be doable with state money. They'll just apply their signage and their transparency to it. So for Bitcoin to be valuable as a tool for human liberty, it has to be valuable enough for people to want to pay for censorship resistance. And that value has to be incremental over what's available in the white market, which rules out all things like contracting and programmability and all this stuff, because it's not going to be a value add. That will already exist in the white market.
Yeah, all this stuff kind of made me come to the realization that proof of work doesn't solve the Byzantine generals problem. It's just the best working model that it currently exists, but it's not really a solution because there's, like you said, you can't prove that it's viable, that can overcome 51%, and that's where the hang-up is.
Right. I mean, what's interesting in Bitcoin is like you can have a 99.9% miner mining all the transactions from now to eternity. As long as they're not censoring, who cares? Right? It's no harm. I mean, presumably they're economically rational, they're collecting their fees, and they're getting as many transactions confirmed as they can, and it's all good. We've been over 50% before.
Ghash.
The 50, So the Byzantine generals problem is perfectly, even if you have a censor, the problem is still solved, right? We can come to agreement on what the next block is with a majority hash power miner. That still works. We're all going to still agree what the next block is. So that's not really the problem. It's not a failure to have a solution to the Byzantine generals problem. The problem is that they can exclude certain transactions from that collectively approved solution. And another thing that's interesting, and I mentioned this in my writing and my old talks, is that every miner censors to some extent. Now, if you use the term a little bit loosely, right? Some miners mine empty blocks. Why? Generally because they haven't had time yet to formulate a new block, and an empty block is still worth better than no block. So once they formulated a new block, then they'll start mining on that. And every once in a while, that intermediate block gets confirmed. Okay, well, they excluded all these possible transactions. Is that censorship? If you want to look at it that way. Another thing to consider is that given say 10,000, 100,000, million transactions in the transaction pool that you could choose from, changing every second, right? That set of transactions changes with every new transaction introduced, with every block confirmed. It changes, which means you have to go through that entire set to try to find the most optimal block to mine on next. And I tell you, I think we did this math on a typical computer like 5 years ago with 100,000 transactions in the transaction pool. To do the math to produce the optimal block to mine on. At the time, I think for 100,000 transactions, typical transactions took about 6 hours. So you have 6 hours of computing to get to an optimal solution, and your set changes every second, which means you have to recompute. Every second, you have to do 6 hours of work, right? And now just increase the number of transactions, increase the complexity of the transactions. Computers are getting faster too, but still, there's no possible way a miner can pick an optimal set of transactions. They have to actually mine most of the time, all the time, in order to be profitable. So miners are going to arbitrarily pick transactions, which means they're going to arbitrarily exclude transactions. So miners are always excluding transactions for some reason or another. Who knows why? They can do it for whatever reason they want. It doesn't matter. The reason it doesn't matter is because it's presumably inconsistent. And as a result, eventually your transaction will get selected based on this fee concept. And if you crank up the fees high enough, it'll stand out enough that we'll get selected through one of these more naive algorithms, right? Knapsack solvers. But they all censor.
So even that censorship scenario, we wouldn't even know right away that there's a censor.
Exactly, because you have no way to know what the optimal set would have been. There's no way to know that. I mean, it would take you years to figure that out, and every second that went along on all the possible, and you don't know what that miner was seeing. One transaction can make all the difference in the world. So yeah, you don't know, but you will know through some kind of like probabilistic.
Eventually,
you'll look at it and you go, okay, basic transaction, depending on
that buffer. This is like a leeway for the censor, also.
Right, but I think like realistically, if there's a real like government censor blocking all transactions of a certain type, we will eventually, you'll eventually be able to see that. Somebody will introduce higher and higher and higher fee transaction is just not going to get confirmed. Or if it does get confirmed, the person, well, put it this way, if they're not enforcing their censorship, those transactions will get confirmed. They'll get confirmed on the 40.
Yeah, I see more orphan blocks.
Well, they'll get confirmed on the 49%, right? So you're going to see
kind of like Ethereum right now.
You're going to see enforcement. And when I say this 51% miner, they can censor. That doesn't prevent people from getting confirmations. They just get confirmed on the 49%. But if they enforce their censorship, that's not building on other blocks, right? Other non-censoring blocks. So if they don't build on non-censoring blocks, you're going to see the orphans. And you're going to see orphans with large time delays. So it will be very visible at some point. And I don't think it will, but the point is that, it really doesn't matter until there's some kind of consistency and enforcement, right? So you can have big miners, you can have arbitrary censorship, you can have even intentional censorship, but as long as there's not enforcement going on, which requires 51% and, concerted effort over time, then you're fine. So Bitcoin does a pretty good job of, solving that problem. And it provides an economic counteracting force to being a censoring, enforcing 51%er. It's just, the question is whether that force is strong enough to counter that censor. But, when I painted the picture of, just looking at the transaction, somebody running a website that basically points out, there's 100 blocks worth of transactions sitting in here with this huge additional fees that you could mine, versus the censor. If you can just get to 51%, probably imagine that people are going to look at that, do the math, and decide on whether they want to throw their hat in the ring. But the censor may keep going, right? Keep not building on those blocks. You get a fork in the chain, and that fork could be very deep, right? You get the market making a long-term bet on getting all these transactions confirmed. So you get a secondary chain that's not mining on the censor's blocks, and you get the censor not mining on the split chain, and they could go on. Just 1 hour, that's 6 blocks. That's a pretty deep fork already. But you could go on days. You could have hundreds of blocks. And so one of the things I do when I in my node, in my implementation, is I anticipate long reorgs, deep reorgs. And I think a lot of node implementations probably don't look so, because it can get challenging to implement that deep reorgs. I think
your node doesn't consider transaction confirmed until X number of blocks.
It's not about that. It's not about considering confirmed. The transaction would be considered, it's considered confirmed if it's in a mined block that's in the strong chain. But it's up to the user of the node to decide whether they are comfortable enough with that level of confirmation, right? But if the thing with reorgs is if you have a secondary chain that's getting longer and longer and longer, you have to store that somewhere, right? That's competing with your main chain. And if it could be arbitrarily long and you're storing it in memory, you could have problems. It becomes kind of like the mempool. How many thousand blocks or how many 100 blocks you're willing to keep on a side chain, just hanging around. Now it might just be headers, right? But you have to maintain that state somewhere. And what happens if there's a hash power war going on and it's very close? 51% doesn't always win. They could lose. So they could be the short chain for a couple hours. They could be the long chain. They could go back and forth. And this actually happened, I think, with the Ether Classic split or something. When they did it, you're going to have this back and forth, which means as a node, you have to be ready to swap back and forth between these two sets of confirmed transactions. Now, in our implementation, the transactions are just transactions. They're on the disk. They're not moving anywhere. All you're doing is moving some pointers around. But it didn't used to work that way. I think it was modeled more on the way Satoshi's worked, which wasn't very comfortable for deep reorgs. And of course, if you're pruning, deep reorgs can become a potential problem. So you have to set pruning limits and resync if you exceed them. There's a number of considerations. So I always try to keep that in mind when we're looking at the node, that reorg depth is not, you can't assume it's going to be 1, 2, maybe 3 blocks. It could be hundreds, and it could go back and forth.
What's the extent that an implementation can track a split that far? I mean, before running out of resources, just based on the node, the resources of the node?
My implementation, the Libbitcoin implementation, has no limit to what it can track. I mean, it's not going to
just the hardware.
It's not going to track back prior to the checkpoint blocks, but that's pretty far back. That's a few 100,000 blocks, because it doesn't require any more space. It doesn't require any more searching. Still constant time lookup, still exact same amount of space. Libbitcoin is always building a candidate index, an index of the candidate headers, the next blocks, and always has the confirmed index as well. So in a situation where there's no competing chain, they're the same, but they can differ. But this, the size, we're talking about pointers, like 8 or 5 byte numbers or 4 byte numbers. So they're not, and it's always there. Like there's always a full candidate chain all the way up to the top, and the full confirmed chain is always at the top. So it doesn't matter if they're the same or they're different. They always take the same amount of space. And it's, like currently, I think the whole index is a couple meg. It's nothing.
Okay.
So yeah,
It resolved it.
if you're holding them in memory, it's a different problem altogether. And then what happens when you shut down? You restart back up. You gotta build the candidate chain that nobody else is distributing. So yeah, it can get challenging. Spent a lot of time on that question because I anticipated at some point we may be looking at deep reorgs.
All right. Eric, greatly appreciate you taking the time. Aeon, as always, man, thanks for keeping these things going, asking the good questions.
Yeah, thanks for letting me up. Thanks for letting me pick your brain, Eric. Always insightful.
I don't know. Thanks for feedback and comments. Much appreciated.
Yeah, Eric, it's been fantastic. Greatly appreciate you taking the time. We value your work. It's amazing what you're doing. And much respect.
Sorry, I don't know very much about Monero.
Yeah, well, hopefully maybe this turns you onto it a little bit to do some research, investigate it if you can find the time. And I know you're obviously focused on your thing, so I totally get that. But would love to have you down to Monerotopia if at all possible. Maybe I'll DM you. Maybe I could convince you to come hang out in Mexico City for a day or two with a bunch of Monero people and take you down the rabbit hole a little bit.
All right. Do that.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. We do these shows every week. Monero Talk. I put the link in the nest, monerotopia.com. We'll be having the conference in May in Mexico City. Thanks again, everybody, and cheers. Have a good night. Thanks, Eric. Greatly appreciate it.
Good night.
Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. We release new episodes every week. You can find and subscribe to our show on YouTube, Odyssey, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Go to monerotalk.live to subscribe for a full list of places where you can watch and listen. If you want to interact with us, guests, or other podcast listeners, you can follow us on Twitter. And please leave us a review on iTunes. It helps people find the show, and we are always happy to read them. So thanks so much, and we look forward to being back next week.